Sit back and relax. The alley is still half asleep when the smell reaches it. A sweetness, a warmth, the unmistakable aroma of bread pulling itself into being. Fog rolls off the Thames, mixing with the rising coal smoke. But somewhere behind a soot-streaked door, a baker is already working. The scent promises comfort, promises life, promises a meal on a cold London morning. Yet if you step closer, if you press through that door, you would find the opposite. A workplace where each breath carries danger, where the very air cuts into the lungs, where the ovens glow like the gates of hell, and where the simple act of baking bread becomes a slow dance with death. Inside, the haze is immediate. It is not the mist of dawn, but a pale, clinging dust that fills the lungs with every inhalation. Flour hangs everywhere, stirred by the swing of sacks, by the slap of dough into troughs, by the shuffle of boots over scattered powder. A boy coughs sharply, clutching at his throat, but there is no relief. To work here is to choke daily on this white fog, to feel it scrape at the chest and settle deep in the lungs. They call it baker's lung. Later, when doctors finally put words to what was killing men in their 40s, but the workers already know it. They feel it in the rasp of their breath, the constant wheeze, the way climbing stairs becomes harder each year. The promise of bread is life for others, but for them it is breathless decay. At the center of the room, the ovens roar. Great coal-fired chambers, brick mouths that must be fed constantly. They glow with a heat that dries the skin and bakes the sweat on the brow until it stings like salt in a wound. The bakers strip to shirts, rolling sleeves to elbows, their arms scorched and scarred from years of reaching too close with long wooden peels. The heat is relentless, pressing against the chest, sucking the strength from limbs. Step too near in exhaustion, stumble as so many have, and the oven gives no mercy. Stories pass quietly among apprentices of men who fainted mid-shift and never rose again, their bodies consumed by the very fire that was supposed to cook the city's breakfast. The bread itself, stacked in neat rows, does not always carry innocence either. To the eye it is pale and fine, the fashionable white loaf demanded by London's middle class. But whiteness does not come cheap, not in an era when true refined flour is costly. To stretch profit, bakers mix powders into the dough, alum to bleach it, chalk to bulk it, even plaster of Paris ground fine enough to fool the tongue. The result looks pure, clean, modern, but inside it hides poisons that twist stomachs and constipate bowels, that leach health from those who eat it daily. The baker knows what he has added, yet he too is trapped. The master orders it, the market demands it, and the penalty for refusing is hunger. Bread becomes both sustenance and toxin, the staff of life corrupted by adulteration. Time itself conspires against the baker. His work does not begin with the morning, but in the dead of night. Long before London's streets stir, he is already bent over troughs, kneading dough by lamplight, stoking fires until the room grows suffocating. He works while others dream, his body bound to rhythms of sleeplessness that grind him down year after year. Eyes burn from fatigue, arms ache from endless kneading, and by the time the city wakes to buy his bread, he has already spent himself. The smile of the shopgirl who sells the loaves hides the fact that the man who baked them may not live to see old age. So the alley fills with warmth, and Londoners rise to the comfort of bread, never guessing what lingers in the air behind the oven door. They taste a slice with butter, inhale the sweet crust, feed their children and feel grateful for the baker's craft. They do not smell the scorched flesh that sometimes accompanies it, do not taste the alum and chalk mixed into the flour, do not hear the coughing of the apprentice boy who will not reach 30. Bread in Victorian London is more than food. It is survival, deception and death rolled into a single loaf, and every bite carries the hidden labour of men who give their lungs, their sleep and sometimes their very lives to feed a city that never sees them. day of a Victorian baker did not begin with the sun. It began while the city still slept, when the streets were dark, the lamps guttering low, and only the watchmen and the night soil men stirred. The baker was already awake, often long before midnight, shrugging on clothes that smelled permanently of flour and smoke, his body heavy with fatigue that never truly left him. Sleep was rationed into scraps, sometimes a few hours in the afternoon or early evening, but never the full measure that let a man feel rested. Bread was needed in the morning, warm loaves ready for shop counters when housewives arrived at dawn. That meant the baker's labour was inverted. When the city dreamed, he toiled. The first task was always fire. The coal ovens had to be stoked hours before dough was ready, and so the baker's morning began with the rasp of shovels, the crash of coal lumps against the furnace mouth, the blast of heat spilling into the chill of night. His arms, still stiff from yesterday's work, strained again to haul the heavy fuel, black dust mixing with the white powder that already seemed to coat every surface of his life. The oven had to be coaxed into readiness, its belly roaring hot but not too hot, the bricks glowing just right so that when loaves were finally slid inside they would rise instead of burn. It was a delicate balance, but it was also brute work, the kind that left sweat pouring down the spine before the first batch was even mixed. Then came the flour, sacks stacked in corners or cellars, each weighing more than a grown child, had to be lifted, carried and emptied into troughs. Apprentices were often set to this, their spindly frames bent under loads of 140 pounds or more, staggering across uneven floors while flour dust exploded into the air with every drop. It coated hair, lashes, nostrils, seeped into throats until every cough brought up pale powder. For the apprentices, many barely into their teens, this was the true schooling of the bakehouse. The steady grind of hauling weight that stunted their growth, curved their spines and left them old before they reached manhood. The troughs filled, water was added, and the real labour began. Kneading was not a genteel act, not the gentle push and fold seen in modern kitchens. It was punishment meted out by the dough itself, a battle of man against a mass of sticky, resistant muscle that had to be beaten, folded, slammed, and worked for long minutes until it yielded. In the Victorian bakehouse this was done in bulk, not with a ball of dough the size of a fist, but with hundreds of pounds of sticky mass that needed taming before it could ever become loaves. Bakers leaned into it with shoulders, arms, and fists, sweat dripping into the mixture, backs aching from the constant bend. The troughs were deep, so a man often had to climb partway inside, his entire torso bent over, his hands punching and dragging the dough until every tendon screamed. This rhythm went on without pause. Knead, fold, slam, sweat. Knead again. Muscles burned, wrists stiffened, fingers cramped, but the work continued, batch after batch. The noise of it filled the bakehouse, the dull thud of fists into dough, the slap of wet flour against wood, the wheeze of men dragging in breath through lungs already scarred by dust. Time vanished in the monotony, each movement blending into the next until exhaustion numbed the body. For apprentices and journeymen alike, the only relief came in brief moments when dough was left to rise. But even then, another task awaited. Bakers did not only knead, they cleaned troughs, swept floors thick with flour dust and coal soot, carried water from pumps, and turned to shaping dough into loaves. This was delicate work after brute labour, but it was no less punishing. Each loaf had to be rolled, shaped, pinched, and set aside. Hundreds, sometimes thousands, depending on the size of the bakery. Fingers swollen from kneading grew raw as they shaped loaf after loaf, the skin cracking from constant contact with damp flour. The bread had to be uniform, the right size, the right shape, or the master would strike out in anger. The master baker loomed process, his authority absolute, his voice cutting through the haze of flour and fatigue. He demanded speed, precision, obedience. Apprentices who lagged or fumbled were cuffed, shouted at, sometimes beaten with rolling pins or peels. It was not cruelty for its own sake, at least not in his mind, but discipline. Bread could not wait, customers would not wait, and any delay meant lost profit. For the boys who endured it, the blows were part of the daily grind, a rhythm as steady as the kneading. Their bodies toughened, or they broke. Many slipped away after a year or two, unable to endure the endless nights, the harsh discipline, the exhaustion. Those who stayed became hardened into bakers themselves, perpetuating the cycle. By the time dawn came, the bakehouse was already suffocating. Heat from the ovens turned the air thick, sweat dripped constantly, and the smell of yeast rose pungent in every corner. Loaves were loaded onto long wooden peels and thrust into the ovens, the sudden blast of heat burning the face and arms of whoever dared approach. The ovens had to be managed constantly. Loaves shifted, pulled, and rotated, each batch timed with care. Too long and they burned, too short and they collapsed. Men's arms grew heavy from lifting the long peels, their eyes stung from coal smoke leaking through cracks, their skin blistered by the radiant heat. All of this unfolded before the city's first customers even appeared. By the time a housewife stepped into the bakery at 7 in the morning, asking for a loaf to feed her family, the men who made it had already worked 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours. Their bodies ached as if beaten, their clothes clung damp with sweat, their lungs rasped with flour dust. They smiled faintly, wiped their hands on aprons and carried on, because another round of dough was already rising. There was no true end to the daily grind. Once the morning rush passed, the bakehouse did not rest. Bread was needed throughout the day, deliveries had to be made, ovens tended. The men snatched moments of rest where they could, eating scraps of stale crusts and gulping weak tea before turning back to their work. Afternoon blurred into evening, evening into night, and again the cycle began. Flour sacks hauled in, coal shoveled, dough mixed. Sleep was an afterthought, a luxury never fully enjoyed. The routine carved itself into the body. Bakers' backs stooped early, their hands gnarled with calluses and swollen knuckles. Their lungs rattled with every breath, their skin rough and blistered from burns. Yet still they rose each night long before the city to perform the same endless labour. To feed London meant to destroy themselves slowly, one sack, one loaf, one sleepless night at a time. Bread was the city's staple, and bakers provided it at a cost that few outside the bakehouse ever understood. The smell that drifted into the alley was warm and comforting, but for the men who made it, the smell was a reminder of exhaustion, pain, and the unending grind of work that consumed their lives. The first thing a man noticed when stepping into a Victorian bakehouse was not the heat of the ovens or the ache of lifting sacks of flour, but the air itself. It hung heavy, not empty, but thick. A pale fog stirred with every motion. Flour dust floated in the lamplight, catching in beams like motes of snow, except these flakes did not melt. They clung. They entered nostrils, coated tongues, scratched at throats. Every breath carried them deeper into the lungs, where they lodged stubbornly, accumulating day after day until a man's chest felt as though he had swallowed the bakehouse itself. For the uninitiated, the first hours in such air were unbearable. Apprentices coughed until their ribs ached, their eyes streamed, their voices grew hoarse. For those who stayed, coughing became a constant companion, woven into the rhythm of kneading, shaping, and hauling, so common it barely warranted notice. The dust was born from every part of the work. When sacks were hauled off carts and split open, flour exploded into clouds that filled the room like smoke. When dough was mixed, handfuls of flour scattered upward with each slap and fold. When troughs were scraped, when bins were filled, when surfaces were dusted to prevent sticking, more powder rose, drifting into hair, eyebrows, even the seams of clothing. It settled on rafters and walls, only to drift down again with the slightest movement. There was no escaping it, no part of the bakehouse free from its reach. Men carried it on their skin even after leaving, their faces ghostly pale, their hair whitened as though aged decades in a single night. They joked grimly about turning into flour themselves, but beneath the humour lay the truth that flour was not only around them, it was inside them. The lungs bore the worst of it. Doctors who began to examine bakers in the 19th century noted the prevalence of a particular illness, wheezing, breathlessness, a chronic rasp that worsened with age. Today it would be recognized as occupational asthma, caused by constant inhalation of dust particles. Then it was simply called baker's lung. Men in their 20s began to notice that running, climbing stairs, or even walking at pace left them winded. By their 30s, many had a constant cough, hacking up phlegm laced with streaks of flour. By their 40s, those who lasted that long, some struggled to breathe even at rest. They often died young, their lungs choked by the very substance that had fed others. Families buried bakers while still in their prime. Their widows left to explain why a man who looked strong and sturdy had wasted away from within. The dust did not only scar lungs, it irritated throats so badly that men often went hoarse, their voices rasping as if permanently caught in a winter cold. Many carried a perpetual dryness in the mouth, their tongues feeling as though they had been sanded. Eyes, too, suffered. Bakers wiped constantly at their faces as flour stung and reddened their eyelids. Tears cut pale streaks through the dust clinging to cheeks, giving them a haunted, almost corpse-like look under the dim light. Skin itched, cracked, and grew inflamed where the dust settled with sweat. For apprentices with youthful complexions, the bakehouse was an early grave for vanity, leaving them prematurely weathered. What made it worse was the fact that there was no escaping the dust even outside the bakehouse. Bakers carried it with them into the streets, leaving trails of pale footprints. Their clothes exhaled small clouds with every step. Lodgers who shared their rooms complained of the white residue clinging to bed sheets and floors. Even in sleep, the dust haunted them. They coughed through the night, their lungs working overtime, their throats raw from hours of inhalation. Families grew used to the sound, the hacking and wheezing that shook walls, as natural a background noise as the rumble of carts outside. The bakehouse itself seemed built to trap it. Low ceilings, narrow walls, poor ventilation, windows often shut to keep heat steady and loaves rising properly. Coal smoke mixed with flour dust until the air became a strange, toxic fog, both gritty and choking. Light barely penetrated it, lamps flickering weakly, their glass darkened by soot. The combination was suffocating, leaving workers drenched in sweat, their chests labouring, their eyes squinting through the haze. For hours at a stretch they endured this, moving through it as if through water, knowing there would be no clear breath until they staggered out into the street. Even then the lungs were reluctant to let go. A baker might walk into the cold night air, inhale deeply, and still feel the scratch and burn of flour clinging inside. Some tried remedies, but there was little relief. They chewed licorice root or drank weak tea to soothe throats raw from coughing. They tied scarves or handkerchiefs across their mouths, but these soon grew damp with sweat and flour, clogging and choking as much as they helped. Spitting became a constant habit. Phlegm streaked with white spat into corners of the bakehouse or into rags tucked at the waist. A few thought-smoking pipes offered protection, the smoke clearing their lungs, but more often it only compounded the damage. There was no true defense, only endurance. Apprentices bore the brunt, their younger lungs overwhelmed quickly. Many were boys of 12 or 13, their small chests still developing, forced to breathe the dust nightly as they carried sacks and kneaded dough. Those who lasted a year or two grew accustomed, or at least claimed to, their coughs blending into the chorus of older men's wheezing. Those who could not endure slipped away, leaving the trade before it destroyed them, though many bore permanent scars in their breathing long after. Masters did not care. There were always more boys to replace the weak. Survival was not proof of resilience, but of grim luck, of bodies better able to tolerate the poison filling the air. The irony was never lost. Flour was life, the foundation of bread, the staff of sustenance for the city. Yet for those who worked it daily, it was poison. Customers marveled at the whiteness of their loaves, at the fine texture of the crumb, never imagining that the same flour that gave them nourishment was silently killing the men who produced it. The baker's gift to the city was not only bread but his own body, traded piece by piece with every breath he drew in that dust-choked room. Doctors began to take note, but only slowly. Reports of bakers dying young were dismissed as anecdotal or blamed on intemperance, poor living, or weak constitutions. It took decades for patterns to emerge, for physicians to see that the trade itself was hazardous. By then, countless men had already died coughing, their lungs scarred, their families left to wonder why bread had cost so much more than pennies. Even when recognition came, reform lagged. Ventilation was expensive. Protective masks were unheard of. The bakehouse continued as it always had, and the dust continued to claim lives quietly, one breath at a time. The men themselves rarely complained. To them, the dust was part of the trade, as natural as burns from ovens or blisters from kneading. They accepted it with the grim fatalism of labourers who knew their work was never meant to be safe. They joked about coughing up dough, about becoming bread themselves, about their lungs rising like loaves inside their chests. Humour was a shield, thin but necessary. Beneath it lay resignation, the knowledge that their lives would be shorter than most, that their work was a sentence as much as a livelihood. And so the bakehouse remained a place of paradox. From its doors emerged loaves that fed families, that kept children alive, that fueled the growth of cities. Inside its walls, men coughed themselves toward early graves, their bodies breaking down under the very substance that others praised. Flour dust was invisible currency, traded for bread and paid with breath. Every loaf that sat warm on a breakfast table was shadowed by it, by the unseen haze that hung in the air of the bakehouse, by the rasp in the throat of the man who had baked it, by the slow suffocation that turned the daily miracle of bread into a slow, grinding death sentence for those who made it. The heat began long before the first loaf touched the peel. It started in the dark hours when the ovens were stoked, when lumps of coal were heaved into the gaping mouths of the great brick furnaces, and flames roared upward like some ancient beast demanding sacrifice. The ovens themselves were vast, arched chambers of brick and stone, capable of swallowing hundreds of loaves at a time. They were the heart of the bakehouse, and they demanded constant feeding. To stand before one was to feel the skin tighten instantly, as though every pore was being pulled open, the heat rushing across the face until eyes watered and lashes curled. It was not warmth, but assault. A steady pressure that seared through cloth and skin alike, leaving a man drenched in sweat even before the day's real labour began. Coal smoke mixed with the flour haze in the air, filling the lungs with something gritty and acrid that burned in the chest. The fire had to be kept at just the right pitch, too fierce and the bread scorched, too weak and the loaves collapsed. This balance was an art as much as a science, and it fell on exhausted men to judge it hour after hour, their faces thrust close enough to feel the furnace's breath scalding their cheeks. The glow lit their arms in orange as they reached forward with long wooden peels, sliding dough into place or hauling loaves free. A moment's hesitation meant a burn. A stumble could mean something far worse. Burns were as common as calluses. Every baker bore them, scars across forearms where flesh had brushed too close to the iron lip of the oven, blisters on hands where the wood of the peel grew too hot, patches of pink or white skin that never fully recovered. Apprentices especially suffered, their inexperience punishing them with each careless move. A loaf shifted too far inside the oven, and they were forced to lean dangerously close, the blast of heat striking like a hammer. Some fainted outright, overwhelmed by exhaustion and the stifling atmosphere, collapsing in front of the open mouth of fire. Those lucky were dragged back by comrades. Others, not so fortunate, fell forward into the inferno itself. Stories of such deaths circulated like whispered warnings. A boy pulled out too late, his body blackened, or a man whose clothes caught fire, screaming as companions beat at him with rags and sacks to snuff out the flames. These were not legends but grim realities, reminders that in the bakehouse the oven was both master and executioner. Even without catastrophe, the heat alone could grind a man down. Shift after shift spent inches from the ovens meant dehydration, dizziness, and a bone-deep fatigue that no amount of tea or crusts of bread could shake. Sweat poured constantly, soaking shirts until they clung like second skins, dripping from brows into dough, stinging eyes so badly that men often worked half-blind. The heat blurred vision, warped judgment, and left the body trembling with exhaustion. To step back into the cooler parts of the room was to feel an almost sickening contrast, the sudden chill raising gooseflesh on sweat-slick arms. Yet the reprieve never lasted. Soon enough, the peels had to be loaded again, the ovens stoked, the cycle renewed. The sheer size of the ovens demanded constant labour. Coal was devoured quickly, and it was the apprentices' task to keep feeding it, hauling heavy buckets of fuel across the floor, their faces blackened with soot even as flour dust clung white to their clothes. The combination left them grey and ghost-like, their skin unrecognisable beneath the layers of grime. They coughed as they worked, spat black phlegm into rags and carried on, the roar of flames drowning out their complaints. The ovens consumed not only coal but men themselves, draining their strength in slow increments until shoulders stooped and hands shook. Burn injuries were treated with the crude methods of the time. A hand scalded by a peel might be plunged into a bucket of water, though often it was dirty, shared among many. Ointments of fat, herbs, or even vinegar were rubbed onto blistered flesh, stinging rather than soothing. Infection was a constant risk. A small burn could fester quickly in the filthy conditions, swelling into an angry wound that crippled a man's grip. Some learned to work through the pain, wrapping cloth tightly around the hand, gripping the peel with raw, trembling fingers. Others had no choice but to leave the trade entirely, their livelihoods ended by a moment's carelessness at the furnace mouth. The psychological toll of the ovens was immense. To stand daily before such fire was to feel both awe and fear, to live with the knowledge that one false step could reduce you to ash. Men joked to mask it, speaking of the ovens as dragons to be tamed. But the laughter was thin. They knew too well the danger. Apprentices were warned not to linger too close, not to let exhaustion carry them into a daze. But warnings could only do so much against bodies wrung dry by endless labour. Many worked half-conscious, their eyes heavy, their limbs trembling, the roar of the oven lulling them into a deadly trance. The summers were worst. In winter the cold streets outside offered a bitter relief when men staggered out at dawn, steam rising from their clothes as they gulped frigid air. But in summer the heat inside was magnified, unbearable, trapping them in an environment hotter than any forge. Shirts stuck permanently to their skin, sweat puddled on from heat stroke. Buckets of water were kept nearby, not just for baking, but for dousing fainting bodies, reviving them enough to push them back to work. The ovens did not pause for sickness or exhaustion. Bread was needed, and the fire cared little for the men who tended it. Accidents spread beyond burns. The heavy wooden peels, often 10 feet long, could break noses or split scalps if swung carelessly in the cramped space. Men stumbled while carrying trays of steaming loaves, scalding themselves or others as the bread toppled. Ovens sometimes cracked or belched coal sparks, sending showers of embers into the bakehouse. Fire was an ever-present threat, not just to men but to entire neighborhoods. A neglected furnace could ignite beams, and many a London street saw flames spread from bakehouse accidents, the very heart of sustenance turning into a spark of destruction. Yet for all the pain and risk, the ovens had to be mastered. Bread was the city's staple, and bakers carried the responsibility of feeding thousands. To shirk the oven was to fail the trade, to lose one's livelihood. Men learned to endure the burns, to live with the heat, to breathe the smoke, because there was no alternative. Their bodies adapted in small ways. Calluses thickened, reflexes sharpened. The skin of their forearms toughened until it could withstand brief brushes with searing iron. But the damage accumulated, unseen until years later, when lungs failed, when skin remained scarred and stiff, when exhaustion caught up in middle age and left men broken. The irony was cruel. For the customers who walked into the bakery in the morning, the ovens represented warmth and comfort. They bought loaves golden and fragrant, imagining hearth and home, never suspecting that behind the counter men had spent the night dancing at the edge of fire. The smell of bread masked the odor of burnt flesh, of singed hair, of sweat dripping onto coals. Each loaf carried within it the heat that had tormented the baker, the fire that had threatened to consume him. The daily confrontation with such heat shaped the men who endured it. They became wary, cautious, their movements economical, every gesture honed by the knowledge that recklessness could kill. They learned to read the fire like others read books, to sense by sight and sound the precise moment when loaves were ready, to judge by instinct when coal was needed, when the oven must be left to settle. This skill, born of necessity, gave them pride even as it cost them health. To be a baker was to be a master of fire, but mastery was never without scars. By dawn, when the first customers arrived, the bakers were already hollow-eyed, their clothes soaked, their arms mottled with fresh burns. They had worked through the night, shoulder to shoulder with the ovens, the heat pounding into them relentlessly. They handed over loaves with weary smiles, and the customers left with baskets full, never realizing that those warm, comforting crusts had been purchased at the price of blistered skin, scorched lungs, and the constant danger of death by fire. The bread was life for the city, but for those who baked it, the ovens offered only a slow, smouldering undoing. The Victorian loaf sitting on a breakfast table looked deceptively innocent. Its crust was pale and neat, its crumb white, soft and uniform. To the eyes of a customer, especially one from the swelling middle class, that whiteness was not just appealing but a mark of refinement. Darker bread, the rough brown loaves of rye or wholemeal, carried the stigma of poverty. To eat white bread was to declare that you could afford better, that you lived above the level of peasants and labourers. In this obsession with purity and refinement, a culture of deception thrived. For whiteness did not come cheaply, not in a world where true refined flour required expensive milling, and where bakers competed with one another to keep prices low while still meeting the expectations of customers who demanded perfection. The result was a loaf laced with substances that had no business being inside a human body. Alum was the most common, a substance used in dyeing cloth and tanning leather, but also discovered to have a curious property when mixed with bread. It made flour seem whiter than it was, masking impurities and giving the loaf a pale uniformity that customers adored. It also tightened the crumb, making stale bread feel firmer, as though it was still fresh. To the customer's eye and hand, alum-laced bread appeared superior, worth every penny. To the body that consumed it, alum was a slow poison. It caused constipation, stomach cramps, and over time could ravage the digestive system. Children fed on it regularly often suffered mysterious ailments that baffled mothers and physicians alike. Yet few suspected their daily loaf, the very staple of survival, was the culprit. Chalk, too, found its way into dough. Ground fine, it blended easily into flour, giving bulk and weight, stretching out what might have been a too small sack into one that could produce dozens of extra loaves. It whitened the mixture as well, feeding the same craving for pale bread. Chalk was inert enough that in small amounts it did not cause immediate distress, but it was no food. To fill stomachs with chalk was to trick the body, to give the illusion of nourishment while delivering little more than dust. For the poorest, who lived on bread alone for much of their diet, this was a cruel trick indeed. They ate to fill bellies but received little sustenance, their malnourished bodies wasting away even as they chewed slice after slice of the city's finest bread. More sinister still was plaster of Paris, the same material used to patch walls and ceilings. Some bakers, or more often the millers who supplied them, mixed it in small quantities with flour to enhance whiteness further and cut costs. To swallow plaster was to invite a harsher form of poisoning, one that inflamed the stomach and left lasting damage. There were accounts of people collapsing after meals, of lingering illness with no clear cause. Reformers who later investigated found with horror that what had been eaten as daily bread had been adulterated with building material. The scandal rocked the public when it came to light, but by then countless loaves had already been consumed, countless stomachs scarred by the trickery. The bakers were not always the villains in this story. Many were as much victims as accomplices. Flour was often adulterated before it even reached them, mixed with whitening powders by unscrupulous millers or suppliers eager to increase profit. The baker who bought it might know, or might suspect, but he had little choice. If his loaves came out darker than his neighbours, customers would abandon him. Housewives did not care to hear explanations about honest flour or natural colour. They wanted white bread, the bread of respectability, and they wanted it at a price they could afford. To sell anything else was to court bankruptcy. So bakers baked with what they had, complicit by necessity, their own survival tied to deception. There were some who actively embraced adulteration, adding more whitening agents themselves, stretching loaves to increase profit margins. They knew what they were doing, but to them it was simply business. Customers demanded cheap bread. The only way to meet that demand, while still covering the cost of coal, rent, labour and ingredients, was to cheat. Morality took a back seat to survival. And in a world where regulation was weak and enforcement weaker still, the chances of being caught were slim. Inspectors were few, tests were rudimentary, and penalties light. The market favoured the cheapest loaf, and the cheapest loaf was almost always the one laced with powders. This deception was not hidden to everyone. Rumours swirled in the press, pamphlets circulated by reformers warned of poisons in daily bread. Doctors suspected links between mysterious ailments and adulteration, though it took decades before science could prove it. Public scandals erupted when investigators exposed shocking practices, but outrage faded quickly when customers returned to their old habits. Cheapness outweighed safety in a world where hunger was a daily threat. Families could not afford to boycott bread, even if it was suspected of making them ill. Better to eat poisoned bread than no bread at all. The hypocrisy of the system was bitter. The same society that exalted white bread as the symbol of refinement was the one most poisoned by it. The rich could sometimes afford loaves made from genuinely refined flour, but the lower middle classes and the poor, desperate to imitate their betters, bought the adulterated versions. They ate plaster and alum in their quest for status, their health sacrificed on the altar of appearances. Meanwhile, the rough brown bread that might have been healthier was scorned as coarse, unworthy of respectable tables. The preference for whiteness was not just aesthetic, it was social, tied to class divisions that left the poorest doubly punished. Mocked for eating dark bread if they avoided white, poisoned if they pursued it. For the bakers, the pressure was relentless. They lived between the demands of customers, the tricks of suppliers, and the risks of exposure. Some were fined when caught adulterating, their reputations ruined, their livelihoods destroyed. Others carried on undetected, their loaves indistinguishable from their neighbors. To them, honesty was not rewarded, only punished. To bake with pure flour meant producing darker loaves that no one wanted, driving customers away. To adulterate was to stay in business. Many chose the latter, resigned to their role in a system they could not change. The health consequences rippled outward. Families dependent on bread as their staple grew weaker, their children stunted, their bodies plagued with digestive disorders. In workhouses and slums, where cheap bread was often the only food distributed, generations suffered under its effects. Reformers visiting such places described the pallor of the children, the constant complaints of stomach pain, the thinness of limbs. Bread was supposed to be the staff of life, yet here it became the staff of sickness, an emblem of how industrial society's hunger for profit corrupted even the simplest staple. Yet despite all this, the smell of fresh bread remained irresistible. Customers queued each morning, coins clutched in hand, waiting for loaves still warm from the oven. They tore them apart eagerly, steam rising, unaware or unwilling to think of what powders had been mixed in. The comfort of bread, the satisfaction of a full belly, outweighed suspicion, and bakers, weary from long nights and coughing lungs, handed it over, knowing too well the compromise baked into each crust. They had no illusions. Their work was deadly not only for them but for those who ate what they produced. But hunger left no space for honesty. It was only through the tireless efforts of reformers, scientists, and outraged journalists that the tide began, slowly, to turn. Investigations revealed the truth in stark detail. Samples tested and found laced with alum and plaster. Campaigns for food safety gathered momentum, demanding laws to protect the public. Eventually, regulations emerged, forbidding such adulteration, imposing standards that began to clean the flour trade. But these victories came late, after decades of harm had already been done. Generations had grown up sickly, their bodies damaged by poisons hidden in their daily bread. The adulterated loaf was the dark underside of Victorian progress. It fed the city, filled bellies, and allowed bakers to stay afloat in a ruthless market. But it also revealed the cost of industrial society's hunger for cheapness and status. Bread that looked pure but carried corruption, bakers forced into complicity by economic survival, customers poisoned by their own aspirations. To break a Victorian loaf was to break open a paradox. Nourishment and deception, comfort and danger, life and death bound together in each pale, poisoned slice. The bread sat on the table still warm, its crust pale and neat, its crumbs soft and white. It looked like nourishment, the kind of loaf a respectable family could set proudly before guests, far removed from the rough brown bread of peasants and the poor. But looks deceived, for within that loaf lay powders and chemicals never meant for the human body. They were hidden there not by accident, but by design, the result of a system that prized whiteness, cheapness, and appearance over safety. And when this bread was eaten day after day, slice after slice, The consequences were written not in the flour but in the bodies of those who consumed it. The effects were often subtle at first, the kind that could be mistaken for the ordinary discomforts of life. A child complained of stomach cramps after supper, twisting and groaning while a mother blamed spoiled milk or restless nerves. A man doubled over in the morning, his belly tight and hard, assuming it was something he had drunk the night before. Constipation became so common it was accepted as normal, a fact of Victorian digestion, though behind it lurked the alum and chalk laced into the bread. What seemed like ordinary ailments were in truth symptoms of a slow poisoning, one that worked not in days but over years, weakening the body gradually until vitality gave way to exhaustion and illness. Alum, the most notorious of the additives, was the silent thief of health. Taken in small doses, it bound the bowels, tightening the body's natural processes until they slowed to a painful crawl. Those who ate it regularly suffered chronic constipation, their digestive systems straining against the chemical's grip. The pain was constant, a gnawing ache in the gut, relieved only occasionally and often violently. Over time, alum damaged the lining of the stomach, leaving it inflamed and raw. Victims complained of nausea, of food sitting heavy and undigested, of a constant sense of being unwell. Children, fed on this bread from infancy, grew weak and sickly, their bodies robbed of proper nourishment even as their bellies appeared full. Mothers noticed their children's pale faces, their thin arms, their listlessness, but rarely suspected the daily loaf as the cause. Bread was supposed to be the foundation of life. That it might be its undoing was unthinkable. Chalk compounded the deception. It was not poisonous in the same way alum was, but it was not food either. To eat chalk was to fill the stomach with dust masquerading as flour, to trick the body into believing it had been nourished, when in truth it had been starved. For the poorest, who often lived almost entirely on bread, this was catastrophic. They ate their fill and yet remained gaunt, their bodies wasting quietly. Malnutrition stalked them even as their mouths chewed and their bellies filled. Chalk in the bread was the cruelest trick, for it denied them not only health but the awareness that health was being stolen. They thought themselves unlucky, weak, cursed by poverty. In truth, they were being cheated with every loaf they bought. Plaster of Paris was worse still, its effects more violent. Made of gypsum, it hardened quickly when mixed with water, and inside the stomach it could create masses that left victims in agony. Cases were recorded of people struck down, suddenly doubled over with pain so sharp they were described as worse than childbirth. For some, these attacks passed after hours of suffering. For others, the damage lingered, leaving the stomach and intestines inflamed, scarred, and weakened. Physicians who examined such patients began to suspect the bread itself, though for years they lacked the tools to prove it. It was only when chemical testing advanced that the truth came clear. The daily loaf was laced with the same material used to patch walls and ceilings, and the bodies of those who ate it bore the scars. The damage went beyond the stomach. Chronic exposure to these additives weakened the entire system. People grew listless, their energy sapped. They aged prematurely, their skin pale, their eyes sunken, their limbs thin. Workers found themselves too weak to endure the long hours demanded of them. Children failed to thrive, their growth stunted, their bones brittle. Deaths mounted quietly, recorded as fevers, wasting or weakness, the hidden cause never named. The poisons did their work silently, shaping a generation's health in ways unseen and unacknowledged. Yet the truth could not be hidden forever. Rumors circulated, whispers in markets and taverns of bakers cheating their customers, of strange powders in the flour. Mothers shared suspicions, doctors muttered doubts. Reformers took up the cause, determined to expose what they called the adulteration of food. Journalists, ever hungry for scandal, ran stories of plaster and alum, their words inflaming public outrage. Pamphlets were published showing bread not as the staff of life but as a poisoned chalice. The public began to ask uneasy questions. Why were their children always sick? Why did their bowels ache so constantly? Why did the bread look whiter than nature could make it? Scandals erupted. Inquests revealed shocking practices. Samples of bread tested and found laced with substances that no baker would ever admit aloud. Newspapers fanned the flames, printing headlines that made customers recoil from their morning loaves. Some bakers were prosecuted, fined, or ruined, their reputations destroyed. Others survived by denying knowledge, blaming millers, or swearing their bread was pure. The truth was that guilt was spread across the entire chain, from suppliers who mixed powders into flour to bakers who used it knowingly or turned a blind eye. Everyone had a hand in the deception, and everyone had something to lose if the public turned away from white bread. The irony was bitter. Those who suffered most from adulteration were the very people who could least afford it. The poor, whose diets depended on bread more than any other food, were poisoned daily, their health sacrificed so that bakers could compete in a ruthless market. The middle classes, eager for refinement, were duped into eating toxins in their pursuit of status. The wealthy could sometimes afford bread made from genuinely refined flour, but even they were not immune to adulterated loaves. Poison spared no one. Doctors began to speak out more boldly, publishing reports of the damage they saw in patients. Reformers pressed Parliament for action, citing bread as the most essential of foods, and therefore the one most in need of protection. Slowly, laws were passed, first weak and easily evaded, later stronger and more effective. Inspections were ordered, penalties increased, and the worst abuses curtailed. But progress was slow, and enforcement patchy. For decades, adulteration continued in some form, driven underground but never fully stamped out. The memory of these scandals left scars in the public imagination. Bread, once taken for granted as the symbol of life and comfort, became a source of suspicion. Families questioned what was hidden in their loaves. Reformers used bread as an example in their larger crusades, arguing that if the most basic food could be corrupted, then the entire system of production and trade was rotten. Bread became both literal and symbolic poison, a reminder of how industrial society's pursuit of profit could corrupt even the simplest staple. In the bakehouse itself, the scandal was both burden and excuse. Bakers complained that they were unfairly blamed, that millers and suppliers bore equal or greater guilt. Yet some embraced adulteration openly, boasting of how much profit they could squeeze from a sack of flour when mixed with powders. Apprentices learned early that honesty was not always rewarded, that to survive in the trade meant learning to compromise. They shaped loaves with flour that they knew was tainted, slid them into ovens, and watched them bake to golden perfection, knowing as they did so that their own families might suffer from the same poisons. The contradiction was stark. Bread was supposed to be the foundation of nourishment, the one food that could be relied upon. Instead, in Victorian England, it became a vector of illness, a daily dose of toxins hidden beneath the guise of purity. Stomach cramps, constipation, wasting, weakness. These were the true legacies of adulteration. And even as reformers fought to clean up the trade, generations of men, women, and children paid the price in their own bodies. To slice into a Victorian loaf was to cut into a paradox. It was warm and fragrant, the smell comforting, the taste familiar. But each bite carried with it powders meant for tanners, dyers, and builders, not for mothers, fathers, and children. The plate that held it was not simply a meal, but a delivery system for slow poison. It was the betrayal of trust, the corruption of necessity, the transformation of the very staff of life into an instrument of suffering. Bread gave life, yes, but in the Victorian age it also quietly took it away. The rhythm of a baker's life was always out of step with the rest of the world. While the city settled into slumber, shutters drawn and lamps extinguished, the baker's day was only beginning. Midnight was not a time for rest, but a signal that the long night of labor lay ahead. In narrow streets and alleyways behind the soot-blackened doors of bakehouses, men and boys stirred themselves from brief naps, rubbing their eyes and splashing cold water onto their faces. The air outside was still, the silence broken only by the rattle of a carriage or the distant echo of boots on cobblestones. But inside the ovens already glowed, and the smell of flour hung heavy, promising that while others slept, bread would rise. There was no escaping the nocturnal nature of the trade. Bread had to be ready by dawn, when shop doors opened and housewives appeared with baskets in hand, demanding loaves fresh from the oven. That simple demand shaped the entire life of a baker. His body was forced to endure hours of toil when it craved rest. His sleep scattered in fragments like crumbs, never whole, never satisfying. He went to bed before evening in an attempt to catch a few hours before the bells tolled midnight. But sleep came reluctantly. The noise of the city, the shouts of children in the street, the creak of carts, all conspired against him. Even when he managed to drift off, the knowledge of what awaited him gnawed at the mind, robbing the rest of its depth. He rose groggy, never refreshed, stepping into a cycle of exhaustion that became his constant companion. The first hours of the shift were the hardest. The body fought against the unnatural schedule, eyelids heavy, limbs sluggish. Apprentices, many barely more than children, stumbled about in a daze, yawning as they hauled sacks of flour or fetched water. Masters barked orders, their voices sharp in the stillness, driving the boys to shake off their stupor and work faster. Weak tea was the only stimulant, gulped down scalding hot in the hope it would stir the senses. Some chewed bread crusts or gnawed at scraps of cheese to trick their stomachs into believing it was morning. But the body knew better, and it protested with every movement. Muscles ached sooner, thoughts wandered, concentration faltered. It took hours for the rhythm of kneading, shaping, and stoking ovens to finally push the men into a grim momentum, one that carried them forward until dawn. There was no pause, no luxury of rest in the middle of the night. Dough waited for no man. Once mixed, it demanded attention, rising and falling in its own time, a tyrant that could not be ignored. Bakers watched it with bleary eyes, hands plunging into troughs again and again, punching and folding with aching wrists. Coal had to be shoveled into ovens, the roar of fire maintained even as sweat poured down brows and soaked into shirts. The night stretched endlessly, broken only by the cycle of tasks, each one replacing the last with mechanical certainty. Men worked as if in a trance, their movements drilled into them by repetition, their minds dulled by exhaustion, yet unable to rest. The hours between 2 and 4 in the morning were the worst, the dead hours when the city was at its quietest, and even the night watchmen nodded on their posts. In those hours, fatigue pressed hardest. Apprentices leaned against walls, eyes closing despite themselves, only to be cuffed awake by a master's hand. Men found their thoughts drifting, their arms slowing, until shouts snapped them back to reality. Some collapsed outright, sliding down to the flour-dusted floor in half-conscious stupor, their bodies refusing to continue. They were shaken, splashed with water, forced back to their feet. Sleep was a forbidden luxury, one that could ruin a batch of dough or let an oven burn too hot. The work demanded constant vigilance, and so men forced their eyes open, blinking against the weight of exhaustion, their bodies stumbling forward even when their minds longed to surrender. The cycle of deprivation shaped everything about a baker's life. Meals were irregular, taken in snatched moments, often nothing more than bread and weak tea consumed between tasks. The stomach rebelled at eating when the body wanted sleep, leaving many with sour stomachs and aching guts. The digestion suffered, much like the mind, never given a proper rhythm, always forced into compromise. Conversations with family were rare, for when wives and children rose in the morning, the baker was staggering home, desperate for rest. His life was lived in reverse, his waking hours mismatched with those he loved, his exhaustion a wall between him and normal life. The toll on the body was immense. Years of night work left men hollow-eyed, their faces pale and drawn, their skin grey beneath the coating of flour dust. Their limbs trembled with fatigue, their backs stooped from the endless lifting and bending. Sleep deprivation gnawed at their health as much as the flour dust did, weakening immune systems, leaving them vulnerable to illness. Colds lingered, coughs deepened, wounds healed slowly. Even the mind frayed under the constant strain. Irritability, short tempers, and bouts of melancholy plagued bakers, their moods soured by the endless grind of labour without rest. Some turned to drink to dull the ache and force themselves into sleep when the shift ended, though alcohol only worsened the fatigue in the long run. The apprentices bore the worst of it. Still young, their bodies not yet hardened, they were forced into the same brutal cycle as their masters, rising in the middle of the night, working until dawn, collapsing into short naps during the day. Their growth stunted, their spirits dimmed. Many carried the scars of sleeplessness for the rest of their lives. Beatings enforced discipline when fatigue slowed them, ensuring that even children were not spared the cruelty of the trade. The bakehouse was no place for weakness, and exhaustion was treated not as a condition but as a failing. The boys learned quickly that to survive meant pushing their bodies beyond their limits, night after night, year after year. By the time the first light of dawn crept through cracks in the shutters, the bakers had already been awake for hours. Their arms ached from kneading, their backs throbbed from lifting, their eyes burned from smoke and dust. Yet the work was far from done. Now the shop front needed stocking, the counters lined with steaming loaves, the trays arranged with care for the customers who would soon arrive. Housewives bustled in, their cheeks fresh from morning air, their eyes bright, their voices cheerful as they asked for loaves warm from the oven. The bakers smiled faintly, handed over bread, and accepted coins with hands swollen and raw. No customer guessed that the men before them had been awake all night, had not seen proper sleep in days, and would collapse into beds the moment the shop closed its shutters again. The rhythm continued without pause. After a few hours of sleep snatched in the late morning or early afternoon, the baker was up again, preparing for another night. His body never adjusted, never fully rested, always dragged back into labour by necessity. The city demanded fresh bread each dawn, and the baker had no choice but to obey. He lived in perpetual exhaustion, a life broken into fragments of rest too small to restore him, surviving not on energy but on sheer endurance. This endless night work was not merely an inconvenience, it was a quiet form of destruction. It aged men before their time, robbed them of health, separated them from their families, and wore them down until they were husks of themselves. Bread came at the cost of sleepless nights, of aching limbs and hollow eyes. Every loaf that graced a breakfast table represented not just flour and water, but hours stolen from a man's rest, his body driven past its limits so that others might eat fresh at dawn. The city slept soundly because its bakers did not. Their lives sacrificed nightly to the rhythm of ovens and dough, their dreams surrendered to the unrelenting demands of bread. The bakehouse door creaked open long before the first cart rattled down the cobblestones, and through it slipped a small, wiry figure, his hands already white with flour from the sacks he had dragged earlier. He was no older than 9, his limbs thin, his eyes heavy with a weariness far older than his years. In the dark of the city, when children should have been curled in their beds, he stood inside the suffocating air of the bakery, staring at ovens that glowed like hungry mouths and at troughs that demanded his strength. Childhood had no place here. Apprenticeship in the Victorian bakehouse was not a gentle training, but an initiation into exhaustion, fear and toil that twisted young boys into bent men before they had even reached manhood. These apprentices were often bound by contract, agreements signed by parents who believed their child would learn a respectable trade and secure a future. For the poorest families, the arrangement was not a choice but a necessity. A boy's hands were a means of survival, and sending him into a bakehouse meant one less mouth at home and perhaps a small wage trickling back. Yet what awaited him inside was less opportunity than ordeal. Apprenticeship lasted years, sometimes 7, during which the boy was expected to live almost entirely under the authority of the master baker. The bakehouse became his world, and within it he learned quickly that mistakes were punished more swiftly than lessons were taught. The night began brutally. While the city's lamps dimmed and families drifted into slumber, the apprentice was roused from his narrow cot, often in a back room of the bakery itself. He wiped the grit of exhaustion from his eyes, splashed his face with cold water, and set to work immediately. His first task might be hauling sacks of flour from storage, each weighing more than he did. He staggered beneath them, his back bowed, his breath ragged as flour dust burst upward, choking his lungs. Older boys mocked him for stumbling, masters barked at him for slowness. Tears pricked his eyes, not just from the sting of dust, but from the knowledge that sympathy was nowhere to be found. He had entered a world where childhood weakness was not tolerated. Once the flour was in place, he joined the others in kneading dough, a task that devoured strength. His small fists pounded against masses of sticky dough that clung stubbornly, his shoulders straining with each push. The troughs were so deep he sometimes had to climb halfway inside, his arms vanishing up to the elbows in dough that resisted him like an enemy. His wrists ached, his back screamed, and sweat poured down his temples, soaking into the flour until he was as white as the bread itself. The repetition dulled his mind, but mistakes, too little water, uneven kneading, were noticed instantly. The master's hand was quick, a cuff to the ear or a crack of a stick across the back. Fear became the boy's greatest teacher, sharper than hunger, sharper than pain. The hours stretched endlessly. Midnight bled into 2, 2 into 4, the ovens roaring louder, the heat pressing down until it seemed there was no air left to breathe. The boy's eyes drooped, his body begged for rest, but rest was a luxury denied him. If he leaned against a wall, if he let his head nod forward, a blow or a shout snapped him awake. Apprentices were expected to match the endurance of grown men, their childish bodies forced into adult labor without pause. Many fainted outright, collapsing onto the flour-dusted floor. They were not met with pity but with kicks, doused with cold water, shoved back to their feet. To fail was to risk dismissal, and dismissal meant disgrace for the boy's family. Survival demanded obedience, and so they stumbled forward no matter how their limbs trembled. The cruelty extended beyond exhaustion. Masters used beatings as a regular form of discipline, convinced that pain forged better workers. A wrong batch of dough, a loaf left too long in the oven, even a clumsy stumble with the peel could bring swift punishment. Stripes from canes or leather straps marked small backs. Bruises darkened thin arms. Apprentices learned to flinch at every raised hand, to anticipate blows before they came. Some masters were harsher than others, but none spared the rod entirely. Apprenticeship was seen not just as education but as correction, a moulding of boys into men through fear and force. The physical toll was written on their bodies. Years of lifting sacks, kneading dough, and enduring sleepless nights stunted growth. Boys who entered the trade short and wiry often emerged into adulthood no taller, their spines bent, their chests sunken from lungs weakened by dust. Many were scarred by burns from ovens, their arms blistered from careless brushes with iron or scalding trays. Their hands were perpetually raw, knuckles swollen from kneading, nails broken and blackened. The bakehouse robbed them not only of rest but of health, shaving years from their lives before those lives had truly begun. Meals offered little relief. Apprentices ate scraps, crusts torn from imperfect loaves, bits of cheese or meat if they were lucky, but more often just bread and weak tea. Their stomachs gnawed with hunger even as they worked with food constantly at hand. They were surrounded by abundance yet denied it, their labor feeding others while they subsisted on crumbs. Malnutrition compounded their exhaustion, leaving them frail and sickly, yet still they were expected to rise each night and repeat the cycle. The psychological toll was just as severe. A boy of 9, torn from family, thrust into a world of shouting men and endless labor, quickly learned that childhood was a thing of the past. There was no play, no school, no exploration beyond the bakehouse walls. His world narrowed to heat, flour, sweat, and fear. Many grew silent and withdrawn, their spirits broken by routine and discipline. Others turned rebellious, answering cruelty with defiance, though such defiance was often beaten out of them. Friendships formed in whispers between tasks, but even these bonds were fragile, as apprentices were pitted against each other, each striving to prove themselves indispensable to the master. Outside observers occasionally took note. Reformers and journalists peered into bakehouses and emerged horrified, writing of boys pale as ghosts, coughing constantly, their faces haggard though they were barely teenagers. Reports spoke of children rising at midnight, laboring until dawn, sleeping only in snatches, their bodies wasting under the strain. Yet change came slowly, and for decades the system endured. Public sympathy was not easily stirred when bread remained cheap and plentiful. The suffering of apprentices was hidden behind the comforting crust of the daily loaf, unseen and unconsidered by those who consumed it. Some apprentices survived the ordeal and rose to become bakers themselves, inheriting the trade and repeating the cycle with new boys brought in under contract. They carried the scars with them, both physical and emotional, yet often believed the system was necessary. Hardship, they said, had made them strong, had taught them discipline. To them, cruelty was not abuse, but tradition, and so they became masters who doled out the same punishments they had once endured. Others escaped as soon as their contracts ended, leaving the bakehouse behind forever, their bodies too broken to continue, their memories too bitter to forgive. For many, however, there was no escape. The trade consumed them from childhood until death, leaving little room for anything else. Their youth vanished into flour dust and firelight, their nights into labor, their days into restless sleep. They grew into men who had never known true childhood, who carried the exhaustion of those years in every step. The city's bread bore their fingerprints, invisible but indelible, a testament to the labor of children forced to sacrifice their growth, their health, and their joy for the sustenance of others. To imagine the bakehouse through the eyes of such a boy is to see not the romance of bread but the cruelty of necessity. Each loaf that emerged golden from the oven carried within it not only flour, water, and fire, but also the childhoods of boys who had been denied rest, denied kindness, denied the simple chance to grow. Their labor fed the city, but it also consumed them, leaving behind stunted bodies and weary souls. In the comfort of morning bread, Victorians tasted not only nourishment but the hidden cost of child labor, a cost measured in bruises, coughs, and lives bent too soon toward weariness and despair. The image of a Victorian bakery from the outside could be deceptively wholesome. A painted shop front, a window filled with loaves stacked in neat pyramids, the warm smell of bread drifting out to entice customers on their morning errands. Yet to step through the back door, past the counter and into the actual bakehouse, was to see another reality altogether. behind the polished display, the conditions under which much of the bread was made were far from clean. The city itself was dirty, choked with coal smoke, horse dung, and human refuse, and the bakehouse absorbed that filth like a sponge. Rats, roaches, flies, and mold were as much a part of the daily environment as flour, yeast, and water. The bread that emerged, steaming from the oven, carried not just the labor of exhausted bakers, but the invisible fingerprints of vermin and rot that thrived in every crack and corner. The first and most persistent invaders were rats. London in the 19th century swarmed with them, black rats and brown rats both, slipping through sewers and cellars, feasting on rubbish heaps, breeding faster than they could ever be exterminated. Bakeries, with their stockpiles of flour and grain, were irresistible havens. Sacks stored in cellars were gnawed open in the night, spilling flour onto the floor where rats scuttled, leaving trails of droppings and greasy smears from their fur. Bakers arrived at midnight to find half-chewed sacks, flour scattered in arcs, and the unmistakable sound of claws skittering into shadows. Boys sent to fetch flour sometimes returned with rat bites on their hands or ankles, the creatures bold enough to defend their feast. Rats chewed not only sacks, but also cords, tools, even loaves left cooling on shelves. They carried fleas, lice, and diseases, spreading unseen contagions through the very food that was supposed to sustain life. Roaches were less visible in daylight, but no less present. They thrived in the warm, damp corners of the bakehouse, crawling into cracks between floorboards, nesting under troughs where dough was mixed. At night, when lamps were extinguished, they swarmed openly, their bodies gleaming brown in the faint glow of banked ovens. Apprentices spoke of lifting lids or cloths in the morning to find roaches scattering in all directions, some crushed under palms or boots, others vanishing back into hiding. Their presence was constant, a creeping contamination impossible to banish in buildings already damp and crumbling. If a roach drowned in a trough of dough, it was often removed with little more than a shrug, the batch still baked and sold. Few customers could imagine such scenes as they sliced into their breakfast loaf. Flies were seasonal tormentors, descending in summer with a persistence that drove men to madness. The heat of the bakehouse, the sweetness of yeast, the damp stickiness of dough, all drew swarms that buzzed incessantly, landing on faces, arms, and loaves alike. Bakers waved them off with flour-dusted hands, but there was no stopping them. They laid eggs in cracks of wood or near scraps of food, their larvae wriggling in the corners where cleaning rarely reached. The smell of fermenting yeast mingled with the stench of fly-infested corners, creating an odour far removed from the romantic image of bread fresh from the oven. To eat a slice of bread was to risk consuming not only flour and yeast, but the traces of flies that had crawled across its surface before baking. The bakehouses themselves were rarely built for cleanliness. Many were cramped cellars, damp with moisture seeping from the walls, their ceilings low and air stagnant. Coal dust from the ovens mingled with flour dust to coat every surface, black and white layered together in grim patterns. Water was carried in buckets, often from questionable sources, sometimes stagnant or contaminated before it ever reached the dough. Wooden troughs for kneading were rarely scrubbed thoroughly. Bits of old dough clung to cracks and corners, fermenting and rotting before being mixed unintentionally into fresh batches. The smell of sourness hung in the air, mingling with the sweat of men and the odour of smoke. Cleanliness was a luxury in a world where time, money, and labour were already stretched to breaking. Mould grew wherever dampness lingered. Sacks of flour stored in cellars absorbed moisture and spoiled, the grain inside sprouting green fuzz or turning rancid before anyone noticed. Yet spoiled flour was rarely discarded. It was mixed with good flour, stretched further to save cost, and baked into loaves that carried a faint bitterness beneath the crust. Customers sometimes noticed the taste, sometimes did not. But the baker could not afford to throw away entire sacks. simply because they had rotted slightly. Bread had to be produced, profit had to be maintained, and mould was simply another hazard to be swallowed. Even the ovens themselves harboured filth. Though fire consumed much, ashes and coal dust settled on trays and loaves, leaving faint gritty traces on crusts. The peels used to slide bread in and out were rarely cleaned beyond a quick scrape, their surfaces sticky with old dough, their handles darkened with grime from countless sweaty hands. Loaves sometimes fell to the floor in the chaos of baking, picked up quickly, dusted off, and returned to the oven as though nothing had happened. Dirt on the floor, rat droppings and flour mixed into a single grey smear. And yet bread emerged from that floor moments later, destined for the tables of families who never imagined its journey. For apprentices, vermin were part of daily life, so common they ceased to shock. Boys joked about rats bigger than cats, about loaves that squeaked when cut. They chased roaches with sticks during pauses in work, stomped flies with bare feet, brushed mould from flour sacks as though it were nothing more than dust. Their world was one where filth was normalized, where survival mattered more than sanitation. To complain was pointless. The master would remind them that bread was baked hot, that the ovens killed whatever crawled into the dough. To some extent he was right, but the comfort was thin. The knowledge lingered that food touched by vermin was food corrupted, and no amount of heat could burn away the image of rats running across flour before dawn. Public scandals occasionally erupted when conditions became impossible to ignore. Inspectors, reformers, or journalists gained entry to bakehouses and emerged appalled, describing in print the rats, the roaches, the filth clinging to every surface. Outrage followed, customers demanding purer bread, authorities promising tighter regulations. But enforcement was patchy, and the system slow to change. The demand for cheap bread outweighed concern for cleanliness. Customers wanted loaves they could afford, and bakers, already ground down by long nights and meagre profits, had little incentive or means to transform their conditions. Sanitation cost money, time, and effort that many simply could not spare. So the rats remained, the roaches crawled, the mould spread, and the loaves continued to appear each morning in shop windows, golden and fragrant on the outside, their hidden histories baked into every bite. The contradiction was stark. Bread was revered as the very staff of life, the foundation of every meal, the one food no household could do without. Yet behind the counter, it was produced in spaces crawling with vermin, mixed with spoilt flour, baked in grime-caked ovens. Customers cut into slices warm and soft, slathered them with butter, and fed them to their children, never imagining the rats that had run across the flour sack or the roach that had drowned in the trough. The illusion of purity was maintained by distance, by the simple fact that no one wanted to look too closely at where their food came from. For the bakers themselves there was no illusion. They lived among the filth, fought it daily, and accepted it as part of the trade. Their lungs already carried flour dust, their skin bore burns, their bodies staggered under sleeplessness. To them, vermin were simply another burden. The rats scurried, the roaches crept, the bread was baked, and life went on. The city ate heartily, and the bakehouse remained a place of contradictions, warmth and filth, nourishment and corruption, life sustained by loaves born in darkness, dust, and the company of creatures no one wanted to see. In this way, Victorian bread carried a secret history invisible to the eye. Each loaf was shaped not only by human hands, but by the scuttling paws of rats, the crawling legs of roaches, the silent spread of mould. It was food born of necessity, baked in the grime of an industrial city that valued cheap sustenance over purity. Bread remained life's staple, but in those hidden rooms where the ovens glowed and the vermin thrived, life and filth were bound together so tightly that they could never be separated. Every bite was nourishment shadowed by decay, man spent his life surrounded by bread, shaping it, kneading it, sliding it into the cavernous mouths of the ovens, and pulling it out again in endless cycles. To outsiders, it might have seemed that such a man lived in abundance, his days and nights immersed in the very food that most people regarded as the foundation of survival. Bread was the staple, the thing no table could be without, and surely a baker's belly was never empty. Yet the truth was far different. The irony of his existence was cruel. Surrounded constantly by loaves, he often lived on the most meagre scraps, stale crusts, and weak tea. His diet, far from hearty or nourishing, was one of quiet deprivation, the kind that eroded the body slowly while the hands continued to produce sustenance for everyone else. The rhythms of the bakehouse made eating properly nearly impossible. The work began at midnight and continued through to dawn, a time when the body was not ready for meals. The hours were filled with sweat, strain, and exhaustion, leaving little room for sitting down at a table or preparing anything substantial. Food was taken in snatches, often standing up, gulped between tasks, or not at all. What the baker had on hand was bread, but not the fresh, fragrant loaves destined for customers. Those had to be sold, each one carrying the profit that kept the bakehouse alive. To eat from the stock was to steal from the day's earnings. Instead, bakers consumed what could not be sold. Yesterday's stale crusts, burnt ends, loaves that had fallen to the floor, scraps scraped from trays. These scraps were often hard and dry, their texture closer to stone than food, requiring soaking in tea or dipping in water to be made chewable. Teeth cracked against them, jaws ached from gnawing, but hunger left no choice. Stale bread filled the belly even if it did little to nourish it. Some bakers softened it into a thin gruel, mixing crumbs with hot water or milk when they could afford it, creating a porridge-like meal that provided warmth more than nutrition. The monotony was crushing. Day after day, the baker consumed the same scraps, his body never receiving the variety of nutrients it craved. His health wearing down under the slow starvation masked by fullness. Tea was the other constant. Weak, oversteeped, and endlessly refilled. It was drunk not for pleasure, but for survival. The caffeine, mild as it was, kept eyelids from closing in the dead hours of the night. The hot liquid gave the illusion of sustenance, warming the stomach and dulling the pangs of hunger when no real meal was possible. For apprentices especially, tea was lifeblood. Boys too young for such labor clutched mugs of it like talismans, gulping the bitter liquid to stay upright as they hauled flour sacks or kneaded dough with aching arms. They drank until their stomachs sloshed, the tannin staining their teeth, the liquid masking how empty their diet truly was. Meat was rare, almost a luxury. A piece of bacon or a sliver of salted pork might appear on a Sunday, eaten with gratitude and remembered for days afterward. Most bakers could not afford regular meat, nor did their schedules allow for meals prepared with it. Vegetables fared no better. Fresh produce spoiled quickly and required time to cook, time the baker never had. When he staggered home in the late morning, it was all he could do to collapse into bed, his body too weary to prepare food. Meals were rushed, haphazard, often eaten cold or scavenged from what was cheapest at the market. Bread, scraps, and tea filled the majority of his diet, supplemented occasionally with cheap cheese, an onion, or a heel of salted fish. Variety was a stranger, and health paid the price. The effects showed themselves in the bodies of bakers. They were often thin, not the robust, well-fed figures one might expect of men who lived in constant proximity to food. Their cheeks were hollow, their eyes sunken, their limbs wiry from exertion rather than nutrition. Stomachs rebelled against the monotony, plagued by indigestion, bloating, and chronic constipation worsened by adulterants in the bread itself. Weakness lingered in their bones, a frailty disguised by the sheer labor of their trade but revealed in moments of collapse. Many aged before their time, their faces lined, their teeth rotting, their bodies brittle. Malnutrition was as much a hazard of the bakehouse as flour dust or burns, and its cruelty lay in the irony. They starved while surrounded by bread. The apprentices, as always, suffered most. Young boys needed food to grow, yet what they received were the scraps no one else wanted. A master might allow them the crusts from rejected loaves, a ladle of thin gruel, or a bit of cheese if he was generous. Often the boys filled their stomachs with tea alone, carrying on with empty bellies until exhaustion overtook them. Their growth was stunted, their bones fragile, their bodies thin and sickly. Many never reached the height or strength they might have had in another trade. The bakehouse consumed their health before they had even reached manhood. The irony extended beyond the walls of the bakery. Customers believed bakers lived well, their shops filled with loaves and their homes stocked with food. Housewives imagined bakers feasting on warm bread pulled straight from the oven, their families never knowing hunger. Yet the truth was the opposite. Customers received the best loaves, and the baker himself lived on the rejects. The man who produced the city's daily sustenance often struggled to feed his own children properly, their meals as plain and meagre as his own. Bread was abundant in his house, yes, but it was often the kind that no one else wanted. Hard, burnt, or stale, washed down with endless cups of tea. There was also the cruel temptation of plenty, to work with fresh loaves every night, to smell them as they baked, to pull them out steaming and golden, and yet to know they were off limits. It was a torment of its own. Apprentices, driven by hunger, sometimes stole fresh pieces, sneaking bites of crusts or stuffing crumbs into their mouths when the master's back was turned. If caught, they were beaten. Theft from the oven was considered one of the gravest sins, a betrayal of trust and profit. The paradox was complete. The very boys who labored to create the bread were punished if they dared to eat it fresh. Illness compounded the misery. With such poor diets, bakers suffered from scurvy in winter, their gums bleeding, their teeth loosening. Rickets bent the bones of apprentices, leaving them crooked before adulthood. Anemia left them pale and faint, prone to collapse in the heat of the ovens. Constipation and digestive troubles were so common they were accepted as normal, part of the trade as much as flour dust in the lungs. Doctors, when they began to take note, described bakers as a class of men peculiarly frail despite their constant work, their bodies undermined not by laziness but by lack of nourishment. In rare cases, a baker's family might fare better if the shop prospered. A successful master could afford meat on Sundays, vegetables more regularly, perhaps even a bit of beer or milk to wash down meals. But such success was rare, and even then the diet remained monotonous. Bread dominated, filling the plate morning, noon and night. What should have been variety was reduced to repetition, and even when the family had enough to eat, they lacked the balance that true nourishment required. For most, the baker's diet was one of contradiction. Abundance that was not abundance, food that was not nourishment, bread that filled but did not sustain. It was a diet shaped by exhaustion and poverty, by the relentless demands of the trade and the harsh economics of Victorian life. Men rose at midnight to create sustenance for the city, but their own sustenance was stolen by the very system that demanded their labour. They fed others while starving themselves, producing loaves that lined the tables of the middle class, while they gnawed on crusts and swallowed tea to keep upright. To imagine the life of a baker is to see not only the sweat and heat of the ovens, but also the hunger gnawing at his belly. He was never far from bread, yet true nourishment remained out of reach. His diet was a reflection of his place in society, essential yet expendable, present at every meal but absent from true abundance. Each stale crust he chewed was a reminder that the staff of life, for him, was also the emblem of deprivation, a daily irony baked into his existence as deeply as the bread itself. The smell of bread should have been one of comfort, the fragrance of yeast rising, crusts browning, warmth filling the air. But in Victorian London, that smell was never pure. It mixed with the foulness of the streets, with soot drifting from chimneys, with smoke belching from factories, with the acrid reek of horse dung and human waste that littered every alley. To walk through a poor district at dawn, when the bakeries were busiest, was to experience a perfume of contradictions, the sweetness of fresh loaves woven with the stench of rot, coal smoke, and sewage. Bread and filth became inseparable, baked together into the daily life of the city. Bakeries were not housed in pristine spaces. They were squeezed into slums, hidden down narrow lanes where the cobblestones gleamed with night's refuse. Outside their doors, gutters overflowed with dirty water, carrying scraps of food, dead rats, and worse. The air was heavy even before the ovens were lit, thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, damp brick, and smoke curling endlessly from chimney stacks. In such places, bread could not escape contamination. Flour carried into the bakehouse passed through air already loaded with soot, settling in sacks and troughs alike. The loaves themselves, cooling by open windows or displayed on counters, absorbed the odours of the street until their fragrance was less yeast and more smoke. The soot was everywhere. It drifted down constantly from the city's countless chimneys, black snow settling on rooftops, windowsills, and open doorways. It coated the hands of bakers even before they touched dough, streaked across flour sacks carried in from carts, and clung to the crusts of loaves left on shelves. To breathe in a bakery was to breathe soot as much as flour, the particles mixing in the lungs until coughs became constant. Bakers learned to accept the gritty taste in their mouths, spitting blackened phlegm between tasks, their throats raw from the mixture of dust and smoke. The customers outside might have brushed soot from their sleeves or skirts, but they never realized that it had seeped into the very bread they ate. Smoke from coal fires compounded the stench. Every bakery relied on coal to heat its great ovens, and the burning never stopped. The smoke poured out of chimneys in thick columns, settling back into the narrow streets where ventilation was poor. Windows were streaked with grime, curtains turned grey, and the air stung the eyes. Inside the bakehouse, the smoke mingled with the sweat of men and the sour smell of fermenting dough, creating an atmosphere oppressive enough to make boys faint. Outside, passers-by wrinkled their noses, the supposed fragrance of bread overwhelmed by acrid coal. For those who lived in the neighbourhood, it was inescapable. Their bread was baked in the same fuel that blackened their lungs, a daily reminder that sustenance and smoke were one. The filth of the streets seeped in more directly. Bakeries often had no separation from the alleys they faced. Doors were left open to vent the heat of the ovens, allowing rats to scurry in and flies to swarm. Children, barefoot and ragged, played outside, their laughter accompanied by the smell of urine in the gutters. Carts rolled past, wheels spattering muck against the bakery walls, horse dung steaming in the morning light. Bakers had no choice but to step through it all as they fetched coal, water, or flour. Their boots carried the filth back across bakehouse floors, leaving trails that crossed the same boards where dough was kneaded and loaves were cooled. Sanitation was a dream. Reality was bread produced shoulder to shoulder with dirt. The mingling of smells was overwhelming. Customers queuing for loaves in the early morning stood with baskets in hand while their noses twitched at the strange combination of scents. Bread fresh from the oven gave off warmth and comfort, but just beyond it wafted the stink of waste from the gutters, the tang of smoke from chimneys, the sharp ammonia reek of public privies not far away. The contrast was dizzying, a reminder that in the city no smell stood alone. To bite into a loaf was to taste not only flour and yeast, but also the very atmosphere of the street where it had been made. Inside the bakehouse, the men grew used to it, though their complaints were constant. apprentices gagged on the stink during their first weeks, their stomachs churning as they mixed dough while the air reeked of rot. Masters shouted at them to grow used to it, to ignore the filth, to focus on the bread. Over time, their noses dulled, their senses numbed, until they no longer flinched at the mixture of yeast and sewage, but the smell clung to them even when they left. Neighbours recognized bakers by the scent that followed them, not just bread but smoke, sweat, and street stench woven into their clothes and hair. It marked them as surely as their flour-dusted skin. Rot was an ever-present companion. Food scraps spoiled quickly in the heat of the bakehouse, fish heads or vegetable peelings left in corners where rats found them first. Damp cellars bred mould that spread across walls and into flour sacks. The odour of decay seeped upward, mingling with the sweetness of baking bread until the contrast became nauseating. Customers might notice an odd tang in the air when they entered, but they rarely connected it to what they were buying. The loaves, once baked, looked clean enough. The stench dissipated into the city air, hidden by the bustle of carts and the press of bodies. Only those who worked within knew how thick the rot had been, how deeply it had sunk into everything around them. Even water carried its own filth. Drawn from pumps that often stood near cesspits or graveyards, it was tainted long before it touched the dough. It smelled faintly of decay, tasted metallic or sour, yet it was poured into troughs without question. The smell of it mingled with flour dust until the entire bakehouse carried the same faint corruption. Tea brewed from it was little better, though the bitterness of leaves masked its taste. Bread made with such water was baked hot enough to disguise much, but the contamination lingered, absorbed invisibly into the food that sustained the city. The customers never questioned the conditions because they could not afford to. Bread was essential, and where it came from mattered less than having it on the table. Housewives ignored the soot, the smoke, the odours of rot clinging faintly to loaves. They cut slices, buttered them, and fed them to their children, grateful for full stomachs. The thought of vermin, of filth carried in from the streets, was pushed aside. In a city already so dirty, one more layer of contamination was hardly remarkable. What mattered was that the bread was cheap, plentiful, and available every morning. But for the bakers themselves, the stench was unavoidable. They lived with it night after night, sweating in the heat, gagging on the foul air, their lungs filling with soot and smoke. It clung to their skin, seeped into their hair, and followed them even as they stumbled home at dawn. They tasted it in every meal, smelled it in every breath, until it became inseparable from their sense of life itself. The stench of the streets was not something outside the bakery, but part of it, fused into the very bread that sustained the city. The loaves, golden and fragrant to the casual eye, carried within them the unmistakable shadow of smoke, soot, and rot, the invisible reminder of the filth from which they had been born. To walk past a Victorian bakery was to inhale both life and decay, sustenance and corruption in equal measure. Bread was the foundation of survival, but in the city it was never pure. It carried with it the stench of the streets, baked into every crust, a reminder that in an age of industrial growth and urban squalor, even the staff of life could not escape the filth of the world that produced it. The idea of bread rising in the oven, golden crusts splitting open to release steam and fragrance, ought to be an image of comfort. Yet in the Victorian city, the comfort of bread was inseparable from the grime of its surroundings. To step into the alleys where many bakehouses stood was to discover that the smell of fresh bread was never alone. It carried with it the acrid sting of coal smoke, the tang of soot drifting from thousands of chimneys, the ammonia reek of horse dung steaming in gutters, and the sickly rot of refuse piled in corners. Bread was baked and sold in districts where life itself stank, where even air was corrupted before it could fill lungs. And so every loaf bore the invisible stamp of its environment. London, Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds, Wherever industry grew, the bakeries followed, pressed into the gaps of narrow streets, cellars, or small rooms behind shop fronts. They were seldom located in airy, clean boulevards. Rents there were too high, and the poor lived where the air was thickest. Bakehouses clustered in slums, where housing leaned against itself and sewage ran freely, where smoke from factories never cleared, and where walls seemed to sweat filth. In these places a bakery did not stand out. Its chimneys joined the others in belching black clouds. Its floors absorbed the same damp that oozed through brick and wood, and its air thickened with the same mix of smoke and stench that marked the entire neighborhood. To enter such a place was to walk into an atmosphere already fouled, the sweetness of yeast only a faint top note above the city's deeper corruption. The soot was relentless. Victorian cities lived under a permanent drizzle of black particles, the product of coal fires in homes, factories, and ovens. The flakes fell silently, settling on windowsills, doorways, cobblestones, and the very loaves cooling on racks. White flour, once poured into troughs, took on a faint grey tint if left uncovered. Apprentices brushed soot from their arms before plunging them into dough, but the black streaks always returned, clinging to sweat and flour dust until their skin was mottled. Bakers coughed it up in thick phlegm, spat it onto floors already streaked with grime, and returned to work as though it were nothing unusual. The bread carried it too, invisible yet present. Soot baked into its pores, eaten daily by families who never realized that the grey film on their window ledges was the same substance baked into their food. Coal smoke itself was even more pervasive. Bakeries consumed enormous amounts of fuel to keep their ovens hot through the night, shoveling coal until flames roared and heat pressed outward into the streets. The smoke thickened in narrow lanes where air barely circulated, pooling between tenements, stinging eyes and throats. Housewives queuing in the morning held handkerchiefs to their noses, the scent of fresh bread battling the choking haze of coal. Inside the bakehouse, the men sweated in it constantly, their lungs raw, their throats lined with a bitterness that tea barely soothed. The smell of bread never stood alone. It was married to the acrid heaviness of smoke, inseparable in memory, a mixture that both comforted and poisoned at once. The filth of the streets seeped more directly into the bakehouses. Doors stood open to vent heat, and through them passed not only customers but the whole environment of the slum. Gutters outside overflowed with filth, their contents tracked across floors by boots. Rats scurried freely between alleys and cellars, leaving droppings in flour sacks and gnawing at the corners of loaves cooling too close to the ground. Flies swarmed in summer, drawn to the sweet damp of dough and the stinking waste just beyond the threshold. The line between street and bakehouse was porous. A loaf might be kneaded in air that carried the stink of horse dung, baked in heat powered by coal smoke, cooled on a rack dusted with soot, and sold to a housewife who never imagined that her family's staple carried traces of the city's dirt in every bite. The smells layered themselves into a heavy cloak. Yeast rising in troughs gave off its sweet, heady perfume, but alongside it was the acrid odor of burning coal. Sweat added its salt, rats added their musk, mold in damp corners added its musty sting. On hot nights when ovens roared and windows stood open, the entire street seemed to pulse with it. Bread and smoke, warmth and rot, comfort and filth fused into one. To live in a neighborhood with a bakehouse was to breathe that mixture daily, to find it clinging to hair, clothes, and skin until it seemed the very smell of existence. Apprentices suffered most from the sensory assault. Young boys, fresh to the trade, gagged on the odors during their first weeks, their stomachs rebelling as they worked in air that seemed unfit to breathe. They carried the stink home with them, their clothes reeking of smoke and yeast, their hair stiff with flour dust and sweat. Families noticed, neighbors teased, and the boys themselves grew accustomed to never smelling clean. Bakers became a marked class, identifiable not only by flour-dusted faces but by the aroma that clung to them, a mixture of bread and filth that no amount of washing could entirely fragrance of warm loaves even as they wrinkled their noses at the stench of the street outside the shop front. Some complained in newspapers about bakeries contaminated by noisome airs, but most accepted it as part of city life. Bread was essential, and whether it carried a faint tang of soot or a suggestion of rot mattered less than having it on the table. For the poor, who lived immersed in filth, one more layer of contamination seemed hardly worth remarking on. For the middle classes, who prided themselves on refinement, the illusion of purity was maintained by distance. They bought bread at counters, never stepping into the bakehouses that produced it. They tasted only what they wished to taste, ignoring the conditions that had shaped it. The stench of the streets was not only a matter of disgust, but of danger. Filth in the air carried disease, and bakeries were not exempt. When cholera swept through neighborhoods, reformers pointed to the unsanitary conditions of food production. They described bakehouses where sewage odors wafted in from nearby drains, where damp cellars bred mold, where bread absorbed not only flavor but contamination. Pamphlets warned that loaves might carry invisible poisons, not just from adulterants added to flour, but from the very air in which they were baked. Public fear rose and calls for reform grew louder, yet the reality remained. As long as bakeries were squeezed into slums, the bread would always be flavored with the city's corruption. The irony was cruel. Bread was celebrated as the staff of life, the daily food that sustained rich and poor alike. It was supposed to embody simplicity and purity, a symbol of nourishment itself. Yet in the Victorian city, it emerged from places where life and decay intertwined, where every loaf carried with it a shadow of soot, smoke, and stench. Bakers, exhausted from night labor, carried trays of loaves to counters with hands blackened by coal, their nostrils clogged with dust, their lungs aching from the very air they breathed. Customers took the loaves eagerly, buttered them, fed them to their children, never knowing that each bite was seasoned with the invisible residue of the streets. For the bakers themselves, the stench became background, something they could not escape and so learned to ignore. But it marked them nonetheless. Their health declined under its weight. Their senses dulled. Their bodies absorbed the filth that surrounded them. They were men and boys who spent their lives in perpetual contradiction, crafting food that symbolized purity while living and working in conditions that reeked of corruption. Each loaf was a paradox, golden on the outside, but born from an environment of smoke, soot, and rot. The stench of the streets did not stay outside the bakery. It entered every crack, every breath, every loaf. It was baked into the very heart of Victorian bread, a reminder that in an age of progress and industry, even life's simplest comfort was shaped by filth. The life of a Victorian baker was bound not only to flour and fire, but to the tools that filled his world, tools that seemed as ordinary as the bread they produced, yet were as dangerous as any machine on the factory floor. Each had its place in the ritual of the bakehouse. Long-handled peels, deep wooden troughs, shovels for coal, paddles for dough, and the looming ovens themselves. They were crude by the standards of modern industry, but they were unforgiving, demanding strength and constant attention, and they bore the capacity to maim as easily as they served. To understand the work of the baker, one must understand the intimate relationship between man and his tools. A relationship written in burns, blisters, bruises, and scars as much as in loaves. The peel was perhaps the most iconic instrument, the baker's extension of arm and hand. It was a long wooden shaft topped with a broad flat board, sometimes wood, sometimes iron, designed to slide loaves into the oven's fiery mouth and retrieve them when baked. Its simplicity disguised its weight. A peel had to be long enough to reach deep into the cavernous oven, often more than 6 feet, and the leverage required to lift a loaded one was punishing. Apprentices struggled to balance it, their thin arms trembling as they attempted to place loaves evenly. A slight tilt could send a whole batch toppling into the ash or onto the floor, where it had to be brushed off hastily and baked anyway. The handle bit into palms, raising blisters that hardened into calluses. The iron-tipped versions grew hot from the oven's proximity, scorching hands if gloves were thin or wet. More than one apprentice bore scars from gripping too near the end, a moment's misjudgment leaving skin raw and blistered. The peel was indispensable, but it was also merciless, its use a constant test of strength and coordination. Before the loaves ever reached the peel, they were born in the troughs, vast wooden containers into which flour, water, yeast and salt were poured and transformed by labour into dough. These troughs were heavy even when empty, carved from thick planks to endure the pounding of fists and the weight of hundreds of pounds of flour. Filled, they became immovable hulks, their sides streaked with paste, their bottoms damp and sticky. Apprentices often had to climb halfway inside to reach the dough, their arms buried up to the elbows, their shirts clinging with sweat and flour. The boards absorbed moisture, swelling and cracking, harbouring scraps of old dough that festered and stank. Cleaning them was a brutal task, scraping at hardened clumps with knives, bending until the back screamed. A slip meant fingers cut or splinters driven deep into the skin. Yet the trough was as central to bread as the oven itself. Its smell was a blend of yeast and rot, fresh dough and old crusts left to decay, a perfume as inseparable from the bakehouse as the acrid tang of smoke. The ovens dominated the space, vast brick chambers built to hold the city's hunger. Their fires were stoked with coal, the shovels clattering as black lumps were heaved into the glowing core. The heat was relentless, a blast that burned the skin even from a distance, a furnace that roared and demanded constant feeding. Bakers stood before them dripping with sweat, their hair plastered to their scalps, their lungs filled with coal smoke and flour dust stirred together into a choking haze. To work close to an oven was to live in fear of missteps. A hand brushed against the iron door meant instant blisters. A sleeve catching sparks meant smouldering cloth. A stumble while holding a peel could send a man tumbling forward into heat that would sear flesh in seconds. The ovens consumed not only coal, but the energy of those who served them, drawing sweat, blood, and sometimes skin itself as payment for bread. Coal shovels were tools in their own right, heavy iron mouths with wooden handles worn smooth by endless use. To wield one was exhausting. Coal had to be lifted not once but hundreds of times a night, each load flung into the oven to keep the fire steady. Splinters pierced hands, handles snapped, and the weight bowed backs. Shovels grew slick with sweat and coal dust, slipping from fingers and crashing to the floor with a clang that sent sparks flying. Apprentices cursed them, yet they could not escape them. Their bodies bent with each load, their shoulders hunched from years of shoveling, until the posture of labour became permanent. Even smaller tools carried risks. Dough knives, broad and sharp, cut through sticky masses but could slice fingers just as easily. Wooden paddles, used for mixing, often splintered, embedding tiny shards into hands already cracked from flour and water. Iron hooks lifted trays or shifted sacks, but one slip and they gouged flesh instead of canvas. The bakehouse was a world of wood and iron, each piece designed for labour but indifferent to human weakness. Tools did not forgive mistakes, and there was little room for hesitation. Apprentices learned quickly that carelessness was punished not by reprimand but by injury. The very layout of the bakehouse turned tools into hazards. Space was cramped, floors slick with spilled water and flour, benches crowded with trays and knives. A boy carrying a peel could strike another across the head without meaning to, the long shaft swinging in a narrow aisle. A man with a shovel of coal might stumble and send sparks onto dough or clothing. Troughs too deep forced awkward postures, twisting spines and straining muscles. Everything was heavy, awkward, and dangerous in a place already hot and suffocating. To survive the night meant not only enduring exhaustion but dodging injury from the very instruments of the trade. Yet despite the hardship, bakers grew strangely attached to their tools. Each peel bore the marks of its user, its handle worn into the shape of a particular hand. Each trough had its smell, its dents, its quirks, known only to those who worked within it. The oven became an adversary and a companion, its heat shaping both loaves and lives. Tools defined the rhythm of the night, dictating when to mix, when to knead, when to fire, when to bake. Without them, bread could not exist. With them, men endured scars, burns, and broken bodies in the service of loaves that would be gone by noon. The tools also symbolized hierarchy. Masters handled the ovens, their experience giving them authority over fire and timing. Journeymen wielded peels, their strength trusted to manage heavy loads. Apprentices were left with the dirtiest tasks, cleaning troughs, hauling coal, carrying flour sacks, scraping grime from tools that would be used again before the day ended. Each tool was not only a piece of equipment but a marker of status, a reminder of where one stood in the brutal pecking order of the bakehouse. When reformers and inspectors finally peered into these spaces, they saw not only the grime and vermin but the dangerous conditions wrought by the tools themselves. They wrote of boys bent double inside troughs too large for them, of burns that left scars across arms, of men with twisted backs from years of lifting shovels and peels. They saw that bread, so simple in appearance, was produced with instruments that demanded more from the human body than it could reasonably give. The tools of the trade were not neutral. They were engines of exhaustion and pain, carving marks into flesh and bone as surely as ovens carved crusts onto dough. The irony was that the tools meant to serve often controlled the men who used them. A peel could not be shortened, an oven could not be cooled, a trough could not be lightened. The baker bent to their demands, his body shaped by their weight, his life ruled by their requirements. Each loaf carried not just flour, yeast, and water, but the imprint of those tools and the suffering they inflicted. To eat Victorian bread was to consume not only food but the labour of men and boys scarred by wood and iron, their lives bent around the tools of the trade. In this way, the bakehouse was less a place of craft than of endurance. Tools that should have been allies became threats. Ovens that promised warmth became furnaces of pain, and the bread that emerged golden and fragrant was stamped invisibly with the marks of the very instruments that had maimed those who made it. The staff of life was produced with tools that demanded blood, sweat, and skin as their price, a reminder that even the most ordinary objects of labor could shape lives with quiet brutality. In the cramped, smoky confines of the Victorian bakehouse, hierarchy ruled as firmly as the fires in the oven. Every man and boy within its walls knew his place, from the master who owned the shop and controlled the books to the smallest apprentice stumbling in half asleep with flour sacks heavier than his own frame. The chain of command was as rigid as any military unit, forged not out of formality or uniforms but out of necessity, exhaustion, and the relentless demands of bread. Bread was life for the city, and the men who made it lived in a world where discipline, obedience, and hierarchy determined who endured and who broke. At the top stood the master baker, often a man who had himself risen through the ranks. He had once been an apprentice beaten awake at midnight, once laboured through the haze of flour dust and smoke. Years of toil and survival granted him authority, and by the time he owned his own oven, he wore the role of master like armour. His word was law in the bakehouse. He decided when the ovens were lit, how the batches were timed, what scraps of bread might be eaten by his workers and what would be reserved for sale. He held the contracts of his apprentices, binding boys for years with signatures inked by their parents, signatures that gave him power over their lives as complete as any jailer's. To the master, discipline was as important as skill. Bread could not wait on softness, and boys who faltered threatened profit. He was often stern, sometimes cruel, his temper sharpened by sleeplessness and the constant strain of balancing production against cost. Beneath him were the journeyman bakers, men who had survived their apprenticeships and stayed in the trade, either too poor to set up on their own or unwilling to take on the risks of ownership. They were the backbone of the bakehouse, strong from years of kneading and lifting, their hands thick with calluses, their lungs lined with flour and soot. Journeymen did the heavy work of mixing, kneading and wielding peels, sliding loaves into ovens that roared like open furnaces. They worked with a kind of resigned endurance, knowing the job was hard but at least familiar. Journeymen carried authority over apprentices, barking orders, handing out cuffs, and ensuring boys worked without pause. They were not masters, but they wielded power over those lower in rank, and many used it freely. To be an apprentice under a hard journeyman was to live in fear of both the oven and the man beside it. At the bottom of this hierarchy were the apprentices themselves, boys bound by contracts that could last 5 to 7 years. They entered the bakehouse as young as 9 or 10, pulled from families desperate to see their children placed in trades that promised steady work. But apprenticeship was less education than servitude. Boys were not there to learn in comfort, but to serve, to labour through nights that broke their bodies and left them stunted before adulthood. They were expected to haul sacks of flour that dwarfed them, to knead dough until their arms gave out, to shovel coal into ovens that singed their hair and blistered their faces. Sleep was rationed to scraps, meals were crusts and tea, and mistakes were punished swiftly. The discipline imposed on these boys was harsh, enforced not only by masters, but by the journeymen above them. A dropped loaf might mean a slap across the face, a burned batch a beating with a strap. Falling asleep at a bench could earn a kick to the ribs, spilling flour could bring blows to the head. The bakehouse was not a place of indulgence, but of correction. Apprenticeship was seen as a means of toughening boys into men, of beating weakness out of them until they could endure the grind of the trade. Those who resisted were broken down, their spirits bent until obedience became reflex. It was rare to find kindness, though some masters took a paternal role, remembering their own youth. Even then, affection was often tangled with strictness, praise mingled with punishment, as though suffering itself was part of the curriculum. The dynamic between masters and apprentices was not just about discipline, but about survival. A master relied on cheap labour to keep the bakehouse running. Apprentices were unpaid or given only a pittance, yet their bodies provided the energy to haul, knead, and clean. Without them, bread would not rise on time, ovens would not stay stoked, floors would not be scrubbed. Their exhaustion was profit for the master, and so they were driven hard, worked to collapse, and told to be grateful for the opportunity of learning a trade. Apprenticeship was supposed to guarantee a future as a journeyman, and perhaps one day as a master. But many boys did not last. They ran away, were broken by illness, or simply faded into other labour when their contracts ended, too ruined to continue in the bakehouse. Hierarchy extended even to the scraps of bread that sustained workers. Masters and their families ate the best loaves, fresh and unblemished. Journeymen might be given access to broken loaves or slightly burnt batches. Apprentices were left with crusts, stale ends, or nothing at all if the day's production had been perfect. Hunger sharpened the divide, making clear who held power and who was lowest in rank. Even scraps became markers of status, rewards and punishments dispensed in crumbs. Yet, for all its brutality, the hierarchy was also a source of strange stability. Apprentices knew their place, and in time they could climb. Journeymen enforced discipline because they had endured it themselves. Masters drove boys hard because they believed the trade demanded it. The cycle continued, generation after generation, each boy enduring what his master once had, each man inflicting what had been inflicted on him. It was a cruel inheritance, but one deeply embedded in the culture of the bakehouse. To soften it was to risk chaos, to risk bread not ready by dawn, and so the hierarchy held, unyielding as iron. Stories circulated of masters who pushed too far, whose brutality crossed into cruelty so extreme it shocked even hardened journeymen. Boys beaten until they could not rise, apprentices locked out in the cold for mistakes, children crippled by overwork. Reformers, when they entered these spaces, wrote with outrage about the conditions. They described bakehouses where boys worked until their growth was stunted, their backs bent, their faces pale with malnutrition and exhaustion. They condemned masters for exploiting youth, for turning children into shadows of men before their time. But the reality was that bread remained cheap, and few were willing to pay more for the comfort of boys hidden in back rooms. Outrage cooled, and the system endured. The hierarchy also carried with it an unspoken bond. Journeymen might beat apprentices, but they also taught them, passing on tricks of timing, kneading and oven management. Masters might punish, but they also offered the hope, however slim, that endurance could lead to mastery one day. Boys looked up to older bakers not only with fear, but with a kind of grim admiration. These men had survived. They had endured the discipline, the hunger, the nights without sleep, and they still stood, strong enough to wield peels and shovels with practiced ease. To an apprentice, scarred and exhausted, that endurance looked like victory, even if it was hollow. The daily life of the bakehouse was shaped by this hierarchy in every detail. Orders came down from the master. Journeymen enforced them. Apprentices obeyed. Tools were passed down the chain. Peels to journeymen, troughs to apprentices, ledgers to masters. Punishments moved downward. Praise rarely moved at all. The entire system functioned because of its strictness, because boys knew they could not refuse, because masters believed harshness was the only way to keep bread flowing. For those outside, the bakehouse was judged by its product alone. The loaves in the window, the price of a roll, the quality of the crumb. But inside, the loaves told another story, one of hierarchy enforced with blows, of boys bent to the will of older men, of endurance purchased at the cost of childhood. Every crust was marked by that hierarchy, even if the marks were invisible. The relationship between masters and apprentices was one of necessity twisted by exploitation, of tradition hardened into cruelty. It was not merely about bread, but about power, about the shaping of lives by discipline and exhaustion. Boys entered the bakehouse as children. They emerged years later as men scarred in body and mind, shaped by the hierarchy that had dominated every waking hour. Bread sustained the city, but it was built on this chain of command, a ladder that rose from crusts and beatings at the bottom to ownership at the top. And even then, the master himself lived with exhaustion and strain, for the hierarchy consumed everyone within it, demanding obedience to the same unyielding truth. Bread must be ready by dawn, no matter what it cost. By the middle of the 19th century, bread was no longer just the quiet sustenance of families, it was a public scandal. For centuries, bread had been treated as sacred, the one food that defined survival, yet in the alleys of London and Manchester, reformers began to pull back the veil on what really filled those loaves. They discovered flour stretched with chalk and plaster, whitened with alum, flavoured by the stench of bakehouses where rats scuttled and children coughed blood into dough. And when they published their findings, the public gasped. What people thought of as wholesome was being revealed as dangerous, even poisonous, and the baker, once a humble craftsman, was painted as both victim of circumstance and willing accomplice. The scandals began in pamphlets and newspapers, where social critics laid out in plain words what the poor had long suspected. They wrote of bakers sifting powdered alum into flour to make cheap, low-grade grain appear dazzlingly white. They spoke of plaster of Paris ground fine and mixed in to bulk out loaves. They revealed that stale dough was re-kneaded into new batches, and that troughs were left crusted with rot. The average customer, walking into a shop that smelled sweet of bread, was shocked to learn that each slice carried with it the possibility of constipation, ulcers, and slow poisoning. Writers did not soften their words. They called it adulteration, a betrayal of the public trust, a sin against the very food that kept the working classes alive. Men like Dr. Arthur Hill Hassell, a pioneering physician and microscopist, turned bread into a subject of science and outrage. In the 1850s, Hassell undertook chemical examinations of loaves purchased across London. With his microscope, he revealed what eyes alone could not: tiny crystals of alum glinting in the flour, chalk dust still present, and specks of foreign matter baked into the crust. His reports, published in The Lancet as part of a broader investigation into food adulteration, electrified the public. Bread, he proved, was not what it claimed to be. It was doctored, disguised, corrupted. The revelations played to a climate already suspicious of industrialization, where people felt that modernity had stolen purity from daily life. If even bread was unsafe, what could be trusted? Charles Dickens joined the chorus, his pen dripping with indignation. In his magazine Household Words, he railed against the dishonest baker who stretched profit by stretching flour. He described the public as swallowing poison unawares, the working poor forced to eat loaves that did them more harm than good. Dickens was a master of taking hidden truths and thrusting them into the faces of his readers, and the idea of tainted bread was perfect fodder for his crusade against hypocrisy and greed. In his telling, the baker's loaf became a symbol of betrayal, proof that industrial society could not even protect its people's simplest need. Public outrage grew so loud that Parliament could not ignore it. Debates raged in the House of Commons, MPs decrying the villainy of alum and demanding measures to protect consumers. Reports were commissioned, experts summoned, laws drafted. But as with so many Victorian reforms, progress was slow, hampered by vested interests and the difficulty of enforcement. Bakers themselves often protested that they were as much victims as anyone. Flour, they said, came already tainted from the millers, and customers demanded white loaves above all. To refuse alum was to risk losing business, for in the public eye, the whiter the bread, the better the baker. Some reformers agreed the system, not the individual, was to blame. Poverty pushed men to cut corners, and competition pushed them further. Still, the exposés did more than stir moral indignation. They began to shape actual reform. The 1860 Adulteration of Food Act was one of the first attempts to legislate against these practices, followed later by more comprehensive laws. Inspectors were appointed, powers granted to test food, penalties introduced. It was imperfect, and adulteration never vanished entirely, but it marked a shift. The baker's trade was no longer a private matter between craftsman and customer. It was a subject of state scrutiny, a public concern, a moral battleground. Reformers had succeeded in pushing bread into the political sphere, where it could be debated and regulated. The scandals also revealed the strange dual image of the baker. On one hand, he was seen as the cheat, the corrupter of bread, the man who mixed chalk into flour and smiled as customers paid. On the other, he was pitied as a man ground down by exhaustion, living on crusts and tea, working in cellars where rats and soot made cleanliness impossible. Reformers painted him as both villain and victim, a man trapped in a system that exploited him while he, in turn, exploited the public. The truth was often both. Some bakers did knowingly add adulterants chasing profit. Others simply did as they had been taught, continuing practices passed down as the norm. The role of the press cannot be overstated. Cheap newspapers spread the revelations far beyond London, into towns and villages where people had never thought to question their bread. Editorial cartoons showed bakers pouring plaster into flour sacks, or families recoiling from loaves riddled with filth. Letters to editors poured in, some defending bakers, others demanding stricter punishment. Bread was no longer invisible. It became a symbol of the Victorian struggle over trust, morality, and the dangers of industrial life. The same forces that produced cheap goods also produced corruption, and bread was the most intimate example. The moralists seized on bread adulteration as proof of society's decay. Sermons were preached warning that greed had poisoned even the staff of life. Reformers in charitable societies demanded that honest bakers be supported, that apprentices be treated more humanely, that the working poor not be forced to choose between hunger and tainted loaves. Bread became part of the broader conversation about industrial reform, alongside sanitation, housing, and labour rights. If a man could not even buy a wholesome loaf for his child, reformers asked, what did progress mean? The irony was that even as scandals broke, the public's appetite for cheap white bread remained unshaken. Reformers begged people to return to brown bread, to accept the natural colour of pure flour, but many refused. Whiteness was status, a sign of respectability, proof that a family was not reduced to coarse fare. Bakers knew this and continued to doctor their flour, even as inspectors prowled. Scandals may have shocked, but habits were hard to change. The white loaf, gleaming in a shop window, carried a lure too powerful to surrender. Reform could make it safer, but it could not make people abandon it. Yet the legacy of those exposés lingered. They laid the groundwork for the modern idea of food safety. The belief that what is sold must be pure, that the state has a role in protecting the consumer. They also revealed the power of journalism, science, and public opinion when combined. A doctor with a microscope, a novelist with a magazine, a reformer with a pamphlet, all could shake the foundation of daily life by showing people the corruption hidden in their bread. For the bakers themselves, the scandals were both humiliation and relief. Humiliation because their trade was dragged into the spotlight as an emblem of dishonesty. Relief because reform at least promised to expose the worst practices and perhaps raise standards across the board. They continued to labour in their hot, filthy cellars, but the world outside now paid attention. The bread they baked was no longer taken for granted. It had become a contested object, fought over in Parliament, denounced in pulpits, tested under microscopes. Bread was still life, but it was also politics, morality, and reform. In the end, the exposés did not cleanse the bakehouse overnight. Rats still scurried, flour dust still filled lungs, apprentices still fainted at the ovens. But the world had changed. The scandals had forced people to look, to question, to demand better. And in doing so, they left an indelible mark, a reminder that even the simplest food could become a mirror of society's failures, and that behind every crust might lurk a story of corruption, reform, and the slow struggle for honesty in the most basic act of nourishment. The history of bread in Victorian Britain was not just the quiet story of flour, yeast, and ovens. It was also the story of hunger and anger, of desperate crowds pouring into the streets when the one food they depended on grew scarce. Bread shortages could transform entire neighbourhoods into powder kegs. Men who had trudged to work on empty stomachs, women who had waited in lines with coins clutched tightly in their fists, children crying from hunger. All could become a mob in an instant if the price of a loaf rose beyond reach. In those moments, the baker's shop front, normally a place of comfort, turned into a battlefield. Bakers themselves, already exhausted from sleepless nights, suddenly found themselves the target of rage, accused of hoarding flour, of watering down loaves, of cheating the poor. Bread was never just food, it was survival. For the working classes, it made up the majority of calories consumed each day. Meat was a luxury, vegetables unreliable, but bread was constant. When loaves were affordable, families endured the grind of industrial life with some measure of stability. When loaves became scarce or expensive, society itself wobbled. The link between bread and peace was so strong that governments watched prices carefully, aware that a sudden rise could mean riots. In villages, towns, and cities, from the early industrial period through the height of the Victorian age, crowds gathered when bread failed them, their fury directed at those they believed most responsible, the bakers. The image of an angry crowd outside a bakehouse was common enough that it became a kind of folklore. Women, often at the head of these protests, shouted at bakers through windows demanding lower prices, accusing them of adulteration or hoarding. They threw stones, smashed glass, sometimes dragged bakers into the street to face their fury. Men joined, overturning carts carrying flour or bread, seizing loaves and distributing them among themselves. It was not simple theft, but an assertion of what many called the moral economy. The belief that bread was a right, that profiteering during hunger was a betrayal so severe it justified collective violence. During shortages, rumors spread like fire. Bakers were said to be hiding sacks of flour in back rooms, waiting for prices to climb. Others were accused of secretly exporting grain while locals starved. Some were whispered to be mixing sawdust into dough to stretch it further, a grotesque image that fueled anger whether or not it was true. The anonymity of rumor became a weapon. By the time a mob reached a bakehouse, suspicion had hardened into certainty, and no amount of protest from the baker could undo the belief that he had betrayed his neighbors. Riots followed a rhythm. It often began with women confronting shopkeepers, their demands clear: lower the price, sell honestly, make the loaves bigger again. If the baker resisted, the crowd swelled. Stones were thrown, doors battered, shutters torn down. Loaves were seized and handed out to children first, a symbolic reversal of the injustice that had sparked the protest. If soldiers or police arrived, they found themselves facing not hardened criminals, but mothers with babies on their hips and apprentices still dusted with flour. Resisting such crowds was dangerous. Too much force and sympathy swung to the rioters. Too little, and order dissolved. One of the most notorious episodes occurred in the early decades of the century, when grain prices spiked and bread became unaffordable for entire neighborhoods. Crowds in London stormed bakehouses, shouting that bakers were traitors to the people. In some districts, bakers barricaded their doors and slept beside their ovens, knives or clubs at hand, fearing that the same loaves they had risen through the night to bake would cost them their lives by morning. Some even hid sacks of flour, not for profiteering but for protection, terrified that mobs would seize everything in sight. Their fears were not unfounded. Records tell of bakehouses stripped bare, ovens smashed, masters beaten until bloodied while apprentices fled. The violence was rarely random. It carried a grim logic. Rioters did not always loot indiscriminately. They demanded that bread be sold at what they considered a just price. Sometimes they forced bakers to sell loaves at a reduced rate under the watchful eyes of the crowd. Coins pressed into hands, transactions completed as if the mob itself were enforcing a law higher than Parliament's. This price setting was a tradition stretching back to earlier centuries, when communities policed their own markets. In the Victorian age, it clashed with the new economic reality of industrial capitalism, where supply, demand, and profit margins mattered more than community expectations. But for the hungry, the older idea lingered. Bread must be affordable, and if it was not, they would make it so. The state's response varied. In some instances, soldiers were called in, their bayonets glinting as they guarded bakehouses. In others, magistrates read the Riot Act to dispersing crowds, the words echoing absurdly against the cries of women who only wanted food for their children. Newspapers often condemned the rioters, portraying them as unruly, dangerous, a threat to public order. But in quieter tones, reformers acknowledged the truth. Hunger had driven the people into the streets, and the baker was the most visible symbol of a system that had failed them. For bakers, these episodes were traumatic. They lived on the edge themselves, their profits narrow, their labor endless, their own families often as hungry as their neighbors. Yet they became the face of exploitation, the ones whose windows were smashed and whose lives were threatened. Some responded with bitterness, seeing their customers as ungrateful and violent. Others with pity, recognizing that the mobs were made up of the same people who bought their bread every morning. A master baker might remember the face of a woman screaming at his door as the same one who had smiled politely the day before. Hunger made strangers of neighbors. These bread riots revealed the fragility of urban life in the Victorian age. A bad harvest, a disrupted trade route, or even rumors of scarcity could tip entire communities into unrest. Bread was too important, too central to survival, to be left to the uncertainties of the market. Reformers seized on these riots as proof of the need for regulation, for honest weights and measures, for oversight of adulteration. They argued that peace could not be maintained if bread remained vulnerable to greed and dishonesty. Some even suggested that the government should guarantee cheap bread, though such measures were resisted by those who insisted the market must run its course. In hindsight, the bread riots were not just explosions of hunger, but acts of resistance. They showed that ordinary people understood their dependence on bread and refused to accept injustice quietly. They targeted bakers not only because they sold the loaves, but because they symbolized the betrayal of trust. Bread was supposed to sustain, not exploit. When it failed, the anger was volcanic. The scenes were chaotic and often violent, but they carried within them a strange moral force. Children clutching stolen loaves, women shouting for fairness, men dragging carts into the street. All these images lingered in the collective memory of the age. They reminded the city that beneath the soot, the industry, the progress, there was still a simple truth. If bread failed, everything else collapsed. And in that collapse, the baker, however unwilling, stood at the center, facing not only his ovens, but the fury of a hungry crowd that saw in him both the cause of their misery and the key to their survival. Thus, the Victorian bakehouse, already a place of exhaustion and danger, was also a place of fear, where the threat did not only come from fire or flour dust, but from the mob outside. Each loaf carried not only the sweat of the men who made it, but the potential for unrest if it was priced too high or weighed too light. Bread riots were the brutal reminder that food was never just food. It was politics, survival, and dignity, and when denied, it became the spark that lit the streets in anger. A baker in Victorian Britain lived a life of contradictions, caught between being indispensable and distrusted, respected for his trade yet mocked for his appearance, central to survival yet forever under suspicion. Bread was the cornerstone of daily life. No meal was complete without it. No family could survive long if loaves vanished from the table. This gave the baker a strange kind of power, for he controlled the one food that crossed all classes, from the poorest laborer chewing stale crusts to the middle-class family slicing white bread for the breakfast table. And yet, that power was shaded by doubt. People whispered that bakers stretched flour with chalk, whitened loaves with alum, or sold stale bread as fresh. The baker was both the provider of life and the trickster who might be poisoning it. His reputation began the moment he stepped into the street. Bakers were marked men. Their clothes, no matter how often washed, were never clean. Flour dust clung stubbornly, leaving faces pale and hair ghostly white. Their aprons bore stains of dough and soot, their arms carried burns from brushes with ovens, their lungs rattled with coughs from flour dust and coal smoke. They carried with them a smell that mixed yeast, sweat, and smoke into a signature scent. To neighbors, this was the perfume of the trade, but it was not admired. It clung too closely to dirt, too tied to the filth of the city. Bakers were identified instantly by this aura of grime. To some it symbolized honest labor. To others it became the butt of jokes, a sign that the man who made bread was himself forever unclean. The soot was particularly damning. Ovens fired with coal-belched smoke that stained walls and faces alike. Bakers emerging from their night's work often looked like miners, their faces streaked black, their arms grey with ash. Satirists and cartoonists seized on this image, portraying bakers as smudged, ragged men, half ghosts with hollow eyes. In cheap penny illustrations, bakers were sometimes mocked as figures who could never be trusted, always hiding something behind their flour-dusted hands. The contrast between the golden purity of bread and the blackened appearance of the man who made it was too rich for society to ignore. It produced laughter, but also a lingering unease. If the baker could not keep himself clean, how clean was the bread he sold? This unease deepened with the revelations of adulteration. Reformers and scientists exposed how loaves were tampered with, alum to whiten, chalk to bulk, even plaster of Paris ground fine and sifted into flour. These discoveries gave the public a reason to distrust their bakers. Families who once took bread for granted began to look at loaves with suspicion, wondering if the crust hid poison. The baker's reputation plummeted. Newspapers described him as a cheat, a man who profited from deception, whose smile across the counter was a mask. Even if some bakers resisted adulteration, the stain was collective. It was said that no baker could be trusted, that even the most honest was likely cutting corners. Customers bought bread because they had no choice, but many did so with resentment, muttering as they handed over coins. This duality, necessity and suspicion, defined the baker's place in society. He was needed desperately, yet rarely celebrated. Other trades might enjoy prestige. The butcher was respected for his strength, the tailor for his skill, the blacksmith for his mastery of iron. But the baker's labor, though constant and exhausting, was treated as almost shameful, something to joke about or criticize. The very act of working at night, sweating in cellars while the rest of the city slept, gave bakers an air of otherness. They were out of step with society's rhythms, ghosts of the early hours who emerged at dawn pale with flour and hollow-eyed. To some, this strangeness made them untrustworthy. To others, pitiable. Rarely did it make them admirable. Women, who formed the bulk of a baker's customers, often held the sharpest opinions. They lined up at counters each morning, coins ready, eyes scanning loaves for signs of lightness or fraud. They complained loudly if a loaf seemed smaller than yesterday's, accused bakers of cheating scales, whispered about what powders might lurk in the dough. Their suspicion was not unfounded. In a world where every penny counted, a bad loaf could mean hunger or sickness for children. But this daily confrontation hardened the baker's image. He was cast not as a craftsman providing sustenance, but as a man to be watched carefully, questioned, challenged. For many households, the baker was as much a source of anxiety as of nourishment. Among the working classes, resentment often boiled over into anger. Bread riots were fueled by the belief that bakers profited while others starved. Crowds smashed shop fronts, shouted insults, accused bakers of hiding flour or selling at inflated prices. In these moments, the baker's reputation was reduced to that of a profiteer, a parasite on the poor. Even when such accusations were exaggerated or false, the image stuck. In the public mind, the baker was was forever on the edge of betrayal, a man whose trade gave him too much power over stomachs and wallets alike. And yet, despite this distrust, society could not do without him. Reformers may have denounced adulteration, customers may have cursed high prices, cartoonists may have mocked his soot-blackened face, but every morning the crowds returned. The queue outside the bakehouse was proof that necessity outweighed suspicion. Bread had to be bought, and bakers had to provide it. This strange dependence made the baker's reputation more complicated still. He was despised yet tolerated, distrusted yet essential. He lived at the intersection of need and disdain, his livelihood secured by hunger, even as his character was tarnished by rumour. There were, of course, exceptions. Some bakers earned genuine respect in their communities, known for honesty, for resisting adulteration, for treating apprentices less cruelly than others. These men built reputations for decency that could withstand the wider scandal. But they were rare, and even they could not escape the taint of their trade entirely. The profession itself was too entangled with suspicion, too tied to the stories of poison and filth, for any individual to fully redeem it. A good baker was praised in private, but the stereotype of the dishonest one remained dominant in the public mind. The baker's reputation was also shaped by class. Middle-class households often sneered at small, grimy bakehouses tucked into alleys, preferring larger shops that advertised cleanliness and modern equipment. To them, the small baker was backward, part of an older, dirtier world. At the same time, they mocked his appearance, treating flour-dusted clothes and soot-streaked faces as signs of lowliness. The working-class poor, meanwhile, saw bakers as both neighbours and oppressors, men who lived among them but wielded power over their stomachs. The master baker straddled these lines, belonging fully to neither class, accepted by none, yet necessary to all. In literature and humour, the baker was rarely romanticised. Unlike the blacksmith or the sailor, he was not celebrated in ballads or folk tales. He appeared in caricatures as comic relief, as the dusty, dishevelled figure sneezing flour, as the dishonest shopkeeper pocketing extra coins. His trade lacked glamour, his reputation weighed down by suspicion. Even in plays or penny novels, if a baker appeared, it was often as a secondary figure mocked for his looks or accused of trickery. The image of the baker as a heroic craftsman simply did not take hold in Victorian imagination. Yet beneath all the mockery and distrust, there was an unspoken acknowledgement of his power. Every loaf carried his mark. Every breakfast table depended on his labour. He may have been ridiculed, but he was indispensable. His reputation as a man could be dragged through mud, but his role in society could not be erased. Bread was too central, too vital, and the baker remained at its heart, whether people trusted him or not. This uneasy place in society left many bakers bitter. They worked through nights, lived with soot and burns, survived on scraps, and then faced ridicule or accusation when they stepped into daylight. They were never far from suspicion, never free from mockery. The irony was cruel. They provided the food most closely associated with life itself, and yet their own lives were marked by disdain. Their reputation was as mixed as the dough they kneaded, part necessity, part suspicion, part pity, part mockery, shaped not only by their own actions but by the anxieties of a society that could not imagine life without bread, but feared what might be hidden in each loaf. Thus the Victorian baker lived in a shadowed respectability. He was central yet peripheral, vital yet mistrusted, mocked even as he fed millions. His soot-covered face, his flour-dusted hair, his weary eyes became symbols not of dignity but of doubt, reminders that the food that sustained society was made in conditions that left both the bread and the man who baked it permanently tainted. The life of a Victorian baker was not only one of exhaustion and poverty, but also one of constant risk. a trade where death lurked in every corner of the bakehouse. The public saw the finished loaves in shop windows, golden and comforting, but they never saw the dangers hidden behind the counters and cellar doors. The bakehouse was not a quiet, tidy workshop, but a place of suffocating dust, roaring fires, heavy tools, and endless fatigue. It was here that accidents were common, and death came quietly, sometimes in the form of a sudden tragedy, sometimes as a slow grinding away of the body until a man was used up before he reached middle age. One of the most terrifying dangers was the flour itself. To most, flour was harmless, the stuff of kitchens and meals, but in a bakehouse it became a suffocating cloud. Flour dust filled the air with every sack tipped into a trough, with every fist plunged into dough, with every peel drawn across a floured board. It clung to skin, hair, and lungs. Bakers breathed it in until their chests rattled, their throats scraped raw, their coughs turned bloody. Doctors would later call it baker's lung, a form of occupational asthma, but to those who lived it, it was simply the cost of the trade. Many grew short of breath in their 30s, struggled to climb stairs in their 40s, and were dead of lung disease not long after. Beyond the slow poisoning of daily dust, there were sudden accidents. Flour bins were deep wooden chests built to hold massive amounts of grain. An apprentice who leaned too far into one, shoveling or smoothing, could lose his balance and fall inside. With the lid closed or the opening blocked, the fine powder filled his nose and mouth, smothering him before he could cry for help. Stories circulated of boys found lifeless in the bins, their faces white as if covered in chalk, their lungs filled not with air but with the very substance they had been hired to work with. These tales were whispered among apprentices as warnings, but accidents continued. A single moment of carelessness, a slip of a boot on flour-dusted floorboards, and the bin became a coffin. Then there was the fire, the constant roar of ovens that never truly cooled. Coal had to be shoveled in endlessly, the heat so fierce it scorched eyebrows and singed hair even from a distance. Men sweated rivers in front of the gaping mouths of ovens, their arms blackened with soot, their sleeves damp with steam. In such conditions, exhaustion was as dangerous as the flames themselves. A man who had worked 20 hours straight, his body trembling with fatigue, could stumble as he wielded a peel, falling against the iron door or, worse, collapsing forward into the oven's heat. There were grim reports of bakers who had fallen into their own furnaces, their cries cut short by fire, their bodies pulled out charred and unrecognizable. More often there were burns, arms blistered, hands scarred, faces pocked with the red marks of stray sparks or sudden gusts of flame. These injuries seldom made the papers, but they accumulated, leaving bakers marked for life by the ovens they served. Coal itself brought hazards. Shoveling it was back-breaking, but it also created showers of sparks, bits of glowing cinder that leapt from the shovel and landed on clothes or skin. An apprentice with damp sleeves might be safe, but dry cloth could ignite, turning a boy into a torch before others could smother the flames. Stories of such accidents spread like ghost tales in the trade. Boys running screaming through bakehouses, their aprons ablaze, their skin burned raw. Those who survived bore scars for life, reminders of how close the line between bread and death could be. Exhaustion magnified every danger. Bakers worked through the night, their eyes heavy, their limbs shaking with fatigue. A man half asleep at his bench could let a peel slip and crush a toe, could stumble into a trough and crack his head, could collapse on a flour-dusted floor and never rise again. Some literally worked themselves to death, falling where they stood, their hearts giving out after years of strain. Inquests recorded such deaths in blunt terms: natural causes, heart failure, exhaustion. Behind the words lay the truth. Men had been driven past their limits until their bodies simply stopped. For apprentices, the dangers were multiplied by inexperience. Boys too small to lift heavy sacks strained themselves until hernias ruptured, leaving them crippled. Others fainted from the heat, falling against ovens or collapsing near coal scuttles. Journeymen shouted at them to toughen up, but the bakehouse was no place for weakness. Those who could not endure either left the trade or were broken by it. Some never made it to adulthood, their lungs ruined, their spines bent, their bodies consumed before they reached their prime. Families sometimes spoke of their sons with shame, saying they had been too weak for the bakehouse. But the reality was that no child should have borne such burdens. There were also dangers beyond the walls of the bakery. Delivering bread meant carrying trays or baskets into streets slick with filth, dodging carriages and horses. Men slipped on icy cobblestones, fell under wheels, or were trampled in the rush of city traffic. A boy staggering with a tray of loaves could be knocked into a gutter, his bread ruined, his body broken. The same soot and smoke that fouled bakehouses choked the streets, and bakers who already wheezed from flour dust found no relief outside. Many died not in dramatic accidents but from simple collapse, their bodies too weak to withstand a sudden illness or infection. The newspapers occasionally carried stories of these tragedies, though they were often framed as curiosities. A headline might read, "Baker suffocated in flour bin," or "Apprentice burned in oven mishap," treating the deaths as grim novelties. Reformers, however, seized on such stories to highlight the brutality of working conditions. They pointed to the endless hours, the lack of sleep, the filth, the heat, the dust. These, they argued, were not accidents at all, but inevitable consequences of a system that ground men down and placed profit above human life. They spoke of bakers dying young, their average lifespan far shorter than other trades, their bodies wrecked long before their time. The public, reading these accounts, felt a mix of horror and unease. Bread was supposed to be the food of life, yet it was born in places of death. Housewives bought loaves each morning with no thought of the risks endured by those who made them. Children ate slices buttered with jam, unaware that boys their own age had fainted in the heat of ovens, had coughed themselves into early graves, had burned their hands until the skin blistered. Bread was cheap because lives were not valued, because bakers were expendable. For the bakers themselves, accidents and deaths were part of the trade's grim reality. They did not speak of them often, except in hushed warnings to apprentices. They told stories of boys smothered in flour, of men burned alive, of comrades coughing blood into dough. These stories were not meant to frighten, but to instruct, to remind the young that vigilance was the only protection in a place where danger was constant. Yet even vigilance was not always enough. The bakehouse demanded so much strength, stamina, endurance, that eventually it consumed those who served it. Death in the bakehouse was not always sudden. Many men simply faded, their lungs collapsing under years of flour dust, their spines bent from lifting sacks, their skin scarred by burns. They aged faster than other men, their faces hollow, their hair grey before its time. They died in their 40s, sometimes younger, leaving widows and children with nothing. Some were buried with little ceremony, their lives remembered only by the loaves they had baked and the scars they had carried. The city mourned them not as individuals, but as part of the endless churn of labour. One baker gone, another to take his place. And yet, despite the constant dangers, men and boys continued to enter the trade. Hunger drove families to place their children in apprenticeships. Poverty forced men to accept any work, and the city's endless appetite for bread meant there was always a need for bakers. Accidents and deaths were tragic, but they did not slow the demand for loaves. The ovens continued to roar, the flour continued to billow, and new boys stepped into the same risks that had claimed their predecessors. The story of accidents and deaths in the Victorian tragedy, but of a system that accepted suffering as normal. Bread was cheap because men's lives were not. Each loaf carried with it the memory of lungs filled with dust, of hands scarred by fire, of boys smothered in flour bins or collapsing from exhaustion. These deaths were the hidden cost of survival, invisible to the customers who bought bread by the penny, but all too real to the men who lived and died in the shadow of the ovens. The story of Victorian bakers did not end when the coal fires dimmed and the soot-blackened ovens were torn down. Their struggles of long nights, diseased lungs, adulterated flour and angry mobs left behind something far larger than the bread they baked. They shaped the way society came to think about food itself, about trust between producer and consumer, about the invisible dangers hidden in the most ordinary of meals. Out of their sweat and suffering emerged not only modern baking, but also an entire culture of regulation, reform, and obsession with whiteness, purity, and safety. The legacy of white bread is as much about law and science as it is about taste, and its roots lie deep in the miseries of Victorian bakehouses. For the Victorians themselves, bread was not only food but a symbol. White bread, in particular, stood for status and refinement. The rich demanded it as a sign that they could afford purity, free of the bran and coarse grains associated with poverty. The poor aspired to it, seeing in its pale crumb a taste of dignity. This cultural obsession gave bakers little choice but to chase whiteness, no matter what it required. When flour alone could not produce the desired effect, alum and chalk stepped in, dangerous additives used to make loaves gleam. What began as a practice born of market demand became a scandal when reformers exposed it, and in the outrage that followed, the groundwork was laid for food safety as we understand it today. The exposés of adulteration were not just about shaming dishonest bakers. They tapped into a growing unease about industrialization, about the loss of trust in a society where goods were increasingly made by strangers rather than neighbors. A loaf from a small village oven was one thing. A loaf from a London cellar, doctored with chemicals and baked amid rats, was another. Reformers like Arthur Hill Hassall, wielding microscopes and chemistry, gave scientific weight to the suspicions of housewives. His findings shocked Parliament into action, and the Food Adulteration Acts of the mid and late 19th century were direct responses to what bakers had been caught doing. Without the scandals of Victorian bread, the very idea of regulating food purity might have taken far longer to emerge. These laws were imperfect, often poorly enforced, but they signalled a turning point. For the first time, the state accepted responsibility for ensuring that food was not simply available but safe. Inspectors could test flour, seize loaves and fine or prosecute bakers. The public's cries for honest bread forced governments to balance laissez-faire economics against the basic needs of survival. What began in the flour bins of Victorian bakehouses would ripple outward, shaping modern consumer protection across all kinds of food and drink. Today, when we glance at ingredients on a supermarket loaf, we are seeing the legacy of those struggles. Each line of regulation, each banned additive, each standard of hygiene owes something to the outcry over Victorian adulteration. But beyond safety, the legacy was cultural. The Victorian pursuit of whiteness in bread cemented an obsession that endures. Even after alum was banned, millers and bakers sought new methods to produce loaves that met the same aesthetic demands. Refinement of flour became a science in itself, with roller mills introduced in the late 19th century grinding grain so finely that nearly all bran and germ was stripped away. The result was bread that was dazzlingly white, fluffy and uniform, precisely what Victorian customers craved. Nutrition was sacrificed for appearance, but by then whiteness had become synonymous with quality. In many ways, the white loaf that dominates modern supermarkets is the descendant of this Victorian mania for purity, refined through technology rather than chemicals. The obsession with white bread carried social weight far into the 20th century. Brown bread, once the staple of peasants, was stigmatized as inferior, coarse, and undesirable. Families who could afford white bread displayed it proudly as though its color testified to their respectability. In urban working-class homes, mothers stretched budgets to provide it, sometimes at the expense of other necessities. The association of whiteness with status, born in Victorian streets, lingered long after the worst adulteration scandals had passed. Even as reformers in later decades tried to reintroduce wholemeal flour for health, the public clung stubbornly to the ideal of the pure white loaf. There was irony in this legacy. The very reforms that outlawed alum and plaster of Paris cleared the path for new technologies that produced bread even whiter than before. Science had removed the poison but left the aesthetic intact, and so the obsession only deepened. Bread became not just food but a commodity of industrial scale, mass-produced in factories far larger than any Victorian bakehouse. The men who had once labored through the night with peels and shovels were gradually replaced by machines, their dangers traded for new forms of industrial monotony. Yet the shadow of their struggle remained in the laws, the expectations, and the cultural symbolism that surrounded the loaf. The reputation of bakers, too, was reshaped by this legacy. Once ridiculed as sooty cheats, they slowly became rebranded as respectable tradesmen within a regulated system. No longer could they be accused, at least not so easily, of selling poisoned loaves. The law gave them legitimacy, offering the public reassurance that the bread they bought was tested and safe. But in a strange twist, this very regulation also robbed them of some of their individuality. Where once every baker was known to his neighborhood, trusted or distrusted on his own merits, by the early 20th century bread became standardized, its production hidden behind factory walls. The scandal-ridden figure of the Victorian baker disappeared, replaced by faceless brands that promised purity through machinery and inspection. Yet the cultural memory of Victorian adulteration persisted. Reformers invoked it whenever new food scandals arose, reminding the public of a time when bakers had slipped chalk and alum into their loaves. It became part of a larger story about why regulation was necessary, why vigilance was essential, why trust in food could never again be left solely to the market. Bread was not just a lesson in nutrition, it was a lesson in morality, in the dangers of greed, in the fragility of public trust. The Victorian baker's struggles became cautionary tales told across generations, shaping how society understood the responsibilities of those who produced food. Even today, the legacy of white bread is visible not only in law but in culture. Supermarkets offer endless varieties of loaves, yet the standard against which they are judged is still the soft, pale, uniform slice perfected in the wake of Victorian scandals. Wholemeal, seeded, and artisanal breads are praised by nutritionists, but the white loaf dominates shelves and breakfast tables alike. Advertising continues to present it as wholesome, pure, and comforting, ignoring its history of controversy and adulteration. That association between whiteness and purity, forged in the grime of 19th century bakehouses, still lingers in the collective imagination. The health consequences of this legacy are not lost on modern observers. By stripping away bran and germ, industrial white bread became less nutritious, contributing to deficiencies that reformers of later generations would have to combat. In the 20th century, governments mandated the addition of vitamins and minerals back into flour, a quiet admission that the obsession with whiteness had gone too far. Even here, the ghost of the Victorian baker lingers. His struggles with adulteration and demand for purity echo in every fortified loaf designed to balance appearance with nutrition. The legacy also extends to labour. The brutal conditions endured by Victorian bakers helped shape conversations about working hours, child labour, and industrial safety. Reports of boys fainting by ovens or men coughing their lives away in flour dust were cited in broader campaigns for reform. Bakehouses became part of the evidence for why labour needed protection, why industries required oversight, why profit could not come at the expense of human bodies. Though bakers themselves remained marginalised, their plight fed into the larger movement that eventually secured shorter hours, safer conditions, and recognition of workers' rights. In that sense, every modern labour law owes a small debt to the men who once toiled in the shadows of coal-fired ovens. Thus, the legacy of white bread is not a simple one. It is a story of suffering transformed into law, of scandal turned into reform, of obsession with purity that still shapes our choices today. Behind every slice of supermarket bread lies a history of bakers who coughed blood in cellars, who were mocked for their soot-stained faces, who were dragged before angry mobs and accused of profiteering. Their lives were short, their deaths often unnoticed, but their struggles left behind something enduring. They forced society to confront the hidden dangers in its food, to demand honesty, to legislate purity. They also left us with the paradox of white bread, a food that symbolizes both comfort and corruption, both purity and loss. To eat white bread today is to participate unknowingly in that legacy. Each bite carries echoes of the Victorian past, the soot, the flour dust, the reformers' microscopes, the scandals in newspapers, the laws written to protect the public. It is a reminder that even the simplest food is never truly simple. It is history, culture, struggle, and obsession baked into a loaf. The legacy of men and boys who gave their lungs and their lives to feed a society that distrusted them even as it depended on them.